Hey there and welcome back. If you have come to the end of a long day, if the lights are low and the house has gone quiet around you, then settle yourself down and let the world outside slip away, because tonight we are going travelling again, far back across 500 years, into an age of candle smoke and cold stone and rushes strewn on the floor. You know the name of the woman we are going to follow tonight, or you think you do, though she is the one people remember least of all the six. She was the third of them, the pale one, the still one, the one who came between two storms. She is usually given a single line in the story, the wife who gave the king his son and then conveniently died, and almost everything interesting about her gets lost in that one bleak sentence. Tonight, slowly and without any hurry, we are going to give her back her whole life. Because before she was a footnote in someone else's tragedy, she was a girl in a rambling country house in the green hills of Wiltshire, one of 10 children in an ambitious and faintly scandalous family. And she would travel from there to the very summit of the world and pay for it with her life. And by the end of the few hours we spend together, we will be standing in a vast chapel at midnight, lit by hundreds of torches, watching a tiny prince carried to the font in a blaze of triumph, while the woman who bore him lies in a room nearby, already beginning to die. But that is the end, and we are nowhere near it yet. Before we set out, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether there is rain against the glass or a still and frosty quiet outside. If you find something restful in these slow walks back into the past, you might think about subscribing so that the next of these quiet evenings finds its way to you when you need it. I read the comments, every one of them, and I am always struck by how a story this old can gather people from every corner of the world into the same hushed room at the close of the day. So tell me where your room is tonight, and then let your shoulders drop, and let the present loosen its hold on you, and let us go back. Picture this. A long, low manor house of timber and pale stone, set deep in the rolling green country of Wiltshire in the west of England, in the early years of the 16th century. It is called Wolf Hall, a name that sounds far wilder than the gentle place it describes, for around it the land lies soft and well tended, hedged fields and grazing sheep and stands of old forest, the broad hunting forest of Savernake stretching away beyond the gardens. The house is comfortable rather than grand, a working country seat, its rooms warm with wood smoke and loud with the business of a busy household and a larger family. There are knot gardens laid out in neat patterns, and barns and stables, and somewhere the sound of children, because there are many children here. The air smells of cut grass and horses, and herbs strewn across the floors inside, and the whole place has the settled, prosperous, unhurried feel of a gentry family that has done well for itself, and means to do better. And somewhere inside these walls, around the year 1508, in the ordinary way that ordinary gentlewomen were born, a daughter is born to the Seymour family, and they name her Jane. To understand Jane, you have to understand the family that made her, because the Seymours were a clan on the rise, and she was, in the end, the chief instrument of that rise, though no one could have guessed it when she was small. They were not nobility. They had no ancient title, no seat in the high councils of the realm, no blood that kings took notice of. They were country gentry, landowners of the middling sort, the kind of family that formed the solid backbone of Tudor England, prosperous in their own region and entirely unknown beyond it. But they were ambitious, quietly and persistently ambitious, in the way of families who can feel the ground shifting beneath the old order and mean to climb while the climbing is good. Each generation had married a little better, acquired a little more land, edged a step closer to the world of the court. By the time she was a girl, the Seymours had reached the point that so many gentry families reached in that restless age pressing up against the edge of real consequence, needing only a stroke of fortune to carry them over. They could not have known that the stroke of fortune would be Jane herself, the unassuming middle daughter, the one least likely to set the world alight. Her father was Sir John Seymour, and he was, by the standards of his class, a thoroughly successful man. He had served the crown in the ways a country gentleman was expected to serve, soldiering in his younger days, going on the king's campaigns in France, sitting as a justice in his county, managing his estates, keeping order in his corner of Wiltshire. He had been to court enough to be known there a little, enough to have placed himself within sight of royal favour, and he had been rewarded with minor offices and marks of trust. He was the sort of man the Tudor system was built to use, reliable, loyal, locally powerful, useful to a crown that governed the country through exactly such men. He had built up the family holdings and the family standing, and he had fathered a large brood of children to carry the name forward. From the outside, Sir John Seymour's life looked like a model of solid gentry success, a man who had done everything right and prospered accordingly. But there was a shadow over the house at Wolf Hall, a private scandal that would later be whispered about across the kingdom, and it touched Sir John directly, and we will come to it, because it is part of the world she grew up inside. Her mother was Marjorie Wentworth, and she brought to the marriage something the Seymours valued highly, which was better blood than their own. The Wentworths were a more distinguished family, with connections that reached through a tangle of medieval marriages back toward the old line of kings itself, and Marjorie was considered something of a catch for a Wiltshire knight. She was praised in her youth by a court poet who wrote of her gentleness and her beauty, calling her good and fair, the sort of conventional flattery that nonetheless suggests she had made an impression. She was, by all accounts, a capable and fertile wife, and she bore Sir John a remarkable number of children across the years of their marriage, running the large household at Wolf Hall and raising the brood that would carry the family's hopes. It was from her, perhaps, that she took the qualities that would one day make her fortune, the mildness, the modesty, the quiet good sense, though we should be careful, because we know so little of Jane's inner life that almost anything we say about where her character came from is partly a guess. What we can say is that she was born into a large, ambitious, fertile, outwardly respectable family with a knight for a father and well-bred mother, in a comfortable house in the Green West country, and that nothing about the circumstances of her birth marked her out for anything but an ordinary gentlewoman's life. There is something worth pausing on in Jane's ancestry, in the blood she carried through her mother, because it adds a quiet irony to her story, and tells us something about how the Tudor age worked. Her mother, Marjorie Wentworth, brought to the Seymour marriage a lineage grander than the Seymours' own, and through that Wentworth line, through a tangle of medieval marriages reaching back across the generations, she was distantly descended from Edward III, the formidable 14th-century King of England. It was a remote connection, the kind of faded princely blood that ran, by the 16th century, through many noble and gentry families, diluted and distant, and of no immediate consequence. But it was there, and it meant that the unassuming girl from Wolf Hall, the modest gentlewoman of no high expectation, carried in her veins a thread of the old royal blood, a distant kinship with the very throne she would one day, against all probability, sit beside. It is one of those small ironies that the Tudor obsession with blood and lineage throws up. The Seymours were not nobility, had no title, were merely rising gentry, and yet through Marjorie they had a better pedigree than their station suggested, a connection to royalty that, while too remote to matter in ordinary times, was exactly the sort of detail that could be polished up and emphasized when one of the family suddenly became queen. For when she married the king, the heralds and genealogists set to work, as they always did, tracing and burnishing the new queen's ancestry, finding the noble connections, demonstrating that she was not, after all, quite so far beneath her husband as her modest origins might suggest. The distant descent from Edward III was brought forward and emphasized, a reassurance that the king had not married entirely beneath himself, that there was a strain of royal blood, however faint, in his new queen. And there is a further irony still, for that shared descent from Edward III meant that Jane and Henry were, in fact, distant cousins, related through that ancient descent, as so many of the English nobility and gentry were related to the crown and to each other. This was entirely ordinary, the kind of distant kinship that pervaded the upper ranks of Tudor society, where everyone of any standing was connected to everyone else through the endless intermarriages of the leading families. But it is a reminder that Jane, for all her modest origins, was not quite the common nobody of the dismissive legend. She came from solid gentry stock with a thread of that ancient blood, raised in comfort and respectability, kept by her mother's line to the old kings of England. She was ordinary by the standards of the court, certainly, plain and modestly educated, and of no high family, but she was not nothing, and the blood she carried was, in its faded, distant way, the blood of kings. None of this, of course, was why he married her. Henry married Jane for her gentleness and her modesty and her promise of an heir, not for her remote descent from Edward III, which was a detail to be polished up after the fact, rather than a reason for the match. But it is part of the fuller picture of who she was, the unremarkable woman with the better-than-it-seemed pedigree, the rising gentry daughter with the thread of royal blood, and it helps to dispel the lazy notion that she was simply a colourless commoner who happened to catch a king's eye. She was a gentlewoman of good family and respectable, even distinguished ancestry, raised to a modest gentility, who carried in her veins all unknowing through the years of her obscure country girlhood, a faint inheritance from the very throne that fortune would one day, so improbably, carry her to share. And that, in a sense, is the most important thing to understand about Jane Seymour at the start. She was ordinary. She was not a princess of Spain raised by a warrior queen to rule, like the woman who came before her. She was not a dazzling French-polished, sharp-tongued beauty who turned every head in a room, like the woman who came after that. She was an unremarkable, modestly educated gentry daughter from the countryside, one of many children, with no particular prospects and no particular gifts that anyone troubled to record. For the first 20-odd years of her life she left almost no mark on history at all, so faint a presence that we cannot even be certain of the year she was born. And yet this ordinary woman would step, in the space of a few astonishing months, into the most dangerous and exalted position in England, would give a king the son that two formidable queens before her had failed to provide, and would die for it, and would be mourned by that king above all his wives, and would lie beside him in his tomb for the rest of time. The ordinariness is the point. It is what Henry would come to want after the storms, and it is what we so easily overlook when we reduce her to that single bleak line about the wife who died. Tonight we are going to look harder. Let me take you properly inside Wolf Hall for a while, into the house and the country that made her, because she carried this place inside her all her life, and to understand the reserved woman she became, you have to feel the place she came from. Picture the manor as it stood in the early years of the century, a long, low, rambling house of timber and pale local stone, grown over generations into a comfortable sprawl of hall and chambers and service rooms, with its barns and stables and dovecote, and the busy kitchen where the work of feeding a large household never ceased. The mornings began in cold and half light. the household stirring before dawn, fires being built up in the hearths, the smell of wood smoke threading through every room. There were rushes strewn across the floors of the lesser rooms, mixed with sweet herbs that released their scent underfoot, lavender and meadowsweet, swept out and replaced when they grew foul. The windows were small and leaded, letting in a soft broken light, and the walls of the better chambers were hung with painted cloths and tapestries, partly for beauty and partly to keep out the cold that breathed through the stone. Around the house lay the soft, prosperous countryside of Wiltshire, hedged fields and grazing flocks, and beyond the garden stretched the forest of Savernake, ancient woodland that the Seymours held the keeping of, a vast expanse of oak and beech where the deer ran and the king himself would one day hunt. It was a place of seasons and rhythms, governed by the turning of the agricultural year, the ploughing and the sowing and the harvest, the lambing and the shearing, the slaughter before winter, the dark cold months and the slow return of the light. Child raised here grew up close to all of it, to the animals and the land and the weather, to the work of a large house that fed and clothed and warmed itself by its own labour, to the unhurried, deeply traditional life of the English countryside that had gone on more or less unchanged for centuries. Let us imagine what a girl like her did with her days in such a place, in the years before history took any notice of her. She learned the things a gentlewoman of her class was raised to know: the management of a household, the supervision of servants, the still-room with its preserves and remedies, the dairy and the brewhouse and the linen. She learned, above all, the needle, the fine embroidery at which she became so skilled, sitting with the women of the household through the hours, working the elaborate patterns that were both a useful craft and a mark of gentility. She would have learned to read in English, and to write a fair hand, and to keep accounts, and to carry herself as a gentlewoman should, but she was not given the dazzling humanist education of a high lady, the Latin and the classics and the fashionable learning. Hers was a practical, domestic, traditional upbringing, suited to the modest future her family expected for her, a good marriage and the running of some country house of her own. And woven through all of it was the old religion, the traditional Catholic faith that governed the rhythm of every life in that age, the masses and the feast days and the saints' days, the parish church with its bells and its statues and its candles, the deep, unquestioned framework of belief within which the whole of life was lived. She was raised devout in the conventional way of her class, and the old faith sank into her and stayed there, one of the few things about her inner life that we can speak of with any confidence, for she remained attached to the traditional religion to the end of her days, dying with its last rites on her lips. The Wolf Hall that made her was a place of old certainties, of land and faith and family, and the unchanging customs of country life, and the girl who grew up there absorbed those certainties along with the wood smoke and the scent of the strewing herbs, and carried them with her into an age that was even then beginning to tear those certainties apart. She was a daughter of the old England, and she would marry the man who was unmaking it, and that quiet contradiction sat at the core of her strange life. There was, as I said, a shadow over Wolf Hall, and though it belongs to a slightly later moment in the family's story, it is worth telling now, because it tells you something about the world she lived in and the family that surrounded her. The scandal concerned Jane's eldest brother, Edward, the clever and ambitious heir, and his first wife, a woman named Catherine Filiol, whom he had married young. The marriage went badly wrong, and the rumour that attached itself to the failure was as dark as a rumour could be. It was whispered, and the whisper persisted for centuries, that Edward's wife had been unfaithful to him, not with some stranger, but with his own father, Sir John Seymour himself, the master of Wolf Hall. The story held that there had been children of the affair, and that Edward repudiated his wife and cast her off, and that the whole sordid business festered within the family. Whether it was true we cannot now know, for it comes to us through later gossip rather than firm record, and gossip in that age, as in ours, loved nothing better than the disgrace of a rising family. But true or not, the rumour clung to the Seymours, and it meant that the house she came from was not the spotless gentry idol it appeared from the road. There were tensions and secrets and woundings beneath the respectable surface. As there are in most families, only these would one day be murmured about in the corridors of a royal court, because the daughter of this house would become a queen, and the families of queens have no privacy at all. I tell you this not to dwell on scandal, but because it matters to how we see Jane. She grew up in a household that knew, behind its closed doors, about disappointment and disgrace, and the gap between how a family appears and how it really is, and she would carry into her own extraordinary destiny a deep instinct for keeping the surface smooth, for not making trouble, an instinct that may have been simply her nature, but may also have been learned in a house where trouble had once erupted with lasting consequences. When the time came that she stood within the most dangerous court in Europe, observing what happened to women who made themselves conspicuous, she would prove herself a mistress of the smooth surface, the quiet manner, the careful avoidance of the misstep that could destroy her. Perhaps she learned it at Wolf Hall. Perhaps it was simply who she was, but the family she came from was one that understood intimately what it was to have things to hide. Now let us meet the brothers and sisters, because the Seymour children were a remarkable brood, and two of the brothers in particular would play enormous parts in the history of England, riding to power on Jane's success, and then destroying themselves once she was gone. Sir John and Marjorie had many children, perhaps 10 in all, though several died young as children so often did in that age. The eldest surviving son, and the most important, was Edward Seymour, the clever, cold, intensely ambitious heir, the one touched by the dark family scandal. Edward was everything the rising Seymours could have hoped for in an heir: sharp-minded, capable, ferociously driven, a natural politician and administrator. He had attached himself to the court and the king's service, and he was clawing his way upward by ability and ambition long before his sister's fortunes transformed the whole family. When she became queen, Edward's rise accelerated beyond anything he could have achieved alone, and he would end eventually as the most powerful man in England, the Lord Protector who ruled the kingdom in the name of his young nephew the king. His is one of the signal stories of Tudor ambition, and it began here in the same nursery as Jane's. The second brother who matters was Thomas Seymour, and if Edward was the cold and calculating one, Thomas was the charming and reckless one, handsome, dashing, vain, and dangerously overambitious, the kind of man women found irresistible and wiser men found alarming. Thomas too would rise on her success, and Thomas too would overreach, scheming and grasping for power he could not handle, until he brought himself down in scandal and treason and lost his head for it, condemned in the end, partly by the contrivance of his own brother. The rivalry between the two Seymour brothers, the cold one and the reckless one, would become one of the bloodiest family feuds of the age, both of them ultimately destroyed, one after the other, by the very ambition that her triumph had unleashed in them. But all that lay far in the future. In the years of Jane's childhood, they were simply her brothers, the eldest sons of an ambitious house, and she was the watchful sister among them, watching, no doubt, as girls in such families watched, learning the ways of a society that revolved around the prospects of its men. There were sisters too, and other brothers, in the sprawling Wolf Hall brood. Among the sisters was Elizabeth, who would also do well from Jane's rise, marrying advantageously once her sister sat on the throne, for the elevation of one daughter lifted the marriage prospects of all of them. For this is worth pausing on, because it shows how a family of this kind functioned. The children were not simply loved individuals pursuing their own happiness, though no doubt there was love among them. They were, collectively, the family's bid for advancement, a portfolio of marriageable daughters and ambitious sons to be deployed for the greater glory and security of the house. Each good marriage, each place at court, each royal favour won by one of them strengthened them all, and Jane, the quiet middle daughter, would turn out to be the most valuable asset the family ever possessed, the one whose extraordinary marriage would carry the whole Seymour clan with her into a world they could otherwise never have reached. When she became queen, she did not rise alone. She pulled the whole clan up behind her, the brothers into power, the sisters into good matches, the family name into the inner circle of the realm, and when she died, that whole structure was left balanced on the life of one small boy, her son, and the men of the family would spend the next decade fighting savagely over who would control him, and that fighting would be the ruin of them. So this was the family that made her, and the family she made, a rising gentry clan from the green hills of Wiltshire, ambitious and fertile and faintly scandalous, with a knight for a father and a well-born mother, and a nursery full of children, two of whom would become among the most powerful and ill-fated men in England. Into this world she was born and raised, neither the cleverest, nor the most beautiful, nor the most promising of the brood, a girl whom no one marked out for greatness, in a house that knew its secrets and nursed its ambitions in the soft West Country, far from the dangerous brilliance of the court. She would not stay there. But the place shaped her, the discretion and the reticence and the deep family loyalty that would define her, and to understand the woman who became queen, you have to begin here, in the rambling manor among the sheep and the forest, with the ordinary girl who was about to be carried further than anyone at Wolf Hall could possibly have dreamed. I want to stay a little longer with the two brothers, Edward and Thomas, because their rivalry is one of the darkest threads of the Tudor age, and because it began here, in the Wolf Hall nursery, alongside the unassuming sister, who would unwittingly give them both their chance at greatness and their road to ruin. They could hardly have been more different, these two ambitious Seymour sons, and the difference between them would eventually become a feud that consumed them both. Edward, the elder, was the cold one, the calculating one, intelligent and disciplined and relentlessly controlled, a natural administrator and politician who advanced by patience and competence and the careful management of his own advantage. He was not warm, not charming, not loved, but he was formidably capable, the kind of man who rose in the world by being indispensable, by mastering the dull, hard machinery of government that flashier men disdained. From his youth he attached himself to the court and the king's service, and he climbed by ability long before his sister's marriage transformed the family's prospects. Thomas, the younger, was everything Edward was not. He was the charming one, the dashing one, handsome and bold and full of swagger, the kind of man who lit up a room and turned heads and made friends easily, and who was also vain, reckless, grasping, and dangerously overambitious without the patience or the judgment to match his appetite. Where Edward calculated, Thomas gambled. Where Edward built slowly, Thomas grasped greedily. He was the more immediately attractive of the two and by far the more foolish, a man whose ambition vastly outran his sense, and who would eventually destroy himself through sheer reckless overreaching. The contrast between the brothers was the contrast between two kinds of ambition, the cold and the hot, the patient and the impulsive, and for a time, while their sister lived and the family rose, both seemed to prosper. When she became queen, the brothers were swept up in her wake into heights they could never have reached alone. Edward was raised to the peerage, given titles and offices and lands, brought into the inner circle of power. His careful ascent suddenly accelerated beyond anything his own efforts could have achieved. Thomas too was elevated and enriched, given his share of the spoils of his sister's marriage. And when she bore the prince and then died, the brothers found themselves uncles to the heir to the throne, positioned, when the old king should die, to wield enormous power as the kinsman of the boy who would inherit. The whole family's fortunes now rested on that small child, Jane's son, and the men of the family understood it, and they began, even before he was dead, to maneuver for the position that the boy's accession would open to them. And when Henry VIII at last died and the boy became King Edward VI, it was the elder brother, Edward Seymour, who seized the prize, making himself Lord Protector, the ruler of England in all but name during his nephew's minority, the highest any Seymour ever climbed. But power won is power that must be defended, and the brothers turned on each other, the reckless Thomas scheming and plotting against the cold Edward, overreaching so disastrously that he was arrested and condemned and executed, brought down with the assent of his own brother, who signed away Thomas's life rather than be dragged down with him. And then Edward, having destroyed his brother, was himself destroyed in turn, overthrown by rivals, condemned and beheaded just a few years later, so that both the Seymour brothers, the cold and the reckless alike, ended on the scaffold within a few years of each other, the towering edifice of the family's power collapsing in blood. It is a grim coda to Jane's story, and she did not live to see any of it, but it flowed directly from her triumph, the ambition she had unleashed in her brothers, proving in the end the ruin of them both. The mild sister gave them their greatness, and their greatness destroyed them. We are left to wonder what kind of girl she was, growing up in that house. And here we come up against the central difficulty of telling her story, which is that we know so little. The records are nearly silent on her childhood, as they are silent on the childhoods of almost all women who were not born royal. No letters survive from her early years, no diary, no description by anyone who knew her as a girl, nothing that lets us hear her voice or see her face before the moment, already half her life gone, when the king's glance fell upon her. We reconstruct her, of necessity, from the general shape of lives like hers, and from the few small things her later conduct reveals, and we should be honest that much of what we say of her girlhood is inference rather than fact. It is one of the quiet injustices of history that a woman could become Queen of England and yet leave so faint a trace of the person she had been before. What she was not given was the kind of dazzling intellectual education that her two predecessors as Queen had received, and the contrast is striking and important. Catherine of Aragon had been educated by humanist scholars, could read and write and speak Latin fluently, could argue theology with bishops, was one of the best educated women in Europe. Anne Boleyn had been polished at the most polished courts on the continent, spoke elegant French, was witty and quick, and accomplished in music and dance and the arts of fashionable conversation. She could do none of these things, or did them only modestly. Her Latin was probably little or none. Her French, if she had any, was slight. She was not known for wit or learning or brilliance of any kind. By the standards of the women who had worn the crown before her, she was barely educated at all, a plain country girl who could sew beautifully and run a house and little else that the chroniclers thought worth mentioning. In the dazzling, competitive, intellectual arena of the Tudor court, she ought to have been entirely outshone, a dim little provincial moth among the brilliant butterflies. Yet here is the thing that turns Jane's apparent disadvantages into the very source of her astonishing fortune. The king who would choose her had already had the brilliant, educated, dazzling kind of wife twice over, and both times it had ended in disaster and grief, and the second time, in blood. He had had the learned and unbending Catherine, who argued with him and would not yield and defied him to the end. He had had the sharp and brilliant Anne, who matched him in wit and temper and made his court a battlefield. By the time she came into his view, Henry was a man worn down by clever, difficult, formidable women, and what he found himself longing for was the opposite of all that, something restful and undemanding and soft, and Jane's very ordinariness, her quietness, her lack of brilliance, her gentle and yielding and unthreatening manner became, in that exhausted royal eye, not defects, but precisely the qualities he craved. The plain country girl who could not argue theology or sparkle in French turned out to possess the one quality that the most powerful man in England now wanted above all others in a wife, which was that she made no trouble. Her ordinariness was her gift. It was what the storms had taught him to want. We should be careful, though, not to flatten Jane into mere blankness, the empty vessel of the legend, the passive nothing onto whom Henry projected his longing for peace. There are signs, if we look closely, of a real person beneath the placid surface, and not a foolish one. She was, by the evidence of what she later did, shrewd, observant, and capable of considerable self-command. She had watched, from her place among the Queen's ladies, exactly what happened to women at that court, had seen Catherine destroyed and Anne raised up and then destroyed in turn, had observed at close quarters the whole brutal machinery of royal favour and royal displeasure. And when her own moment came, she would play it with a calculation and a control that no foolish woman could have managed, withholding herself, guarding her reputation, saying and doing precisely the right things at exactly the right moments. That is not the behaviour of an empty vessel. It is the behaviour of a careful, watchful, intelligent woman who had learned, in the most dangerous school in the realm, exactly how a woman survived and rose. The quietness was real, but it was not stupidity. It may even have been, in part, strategy. She had seen what loud women got. She would be quiet, and she would win. So picture her in the years before history takes any notice of her, a young gentlewoman of the Seymour household, modest and mild and skilled with her needle, not showy in the showy way the court prized, but not a fool either, watchful, careful, discreet, the kind of young woman who fades into the background of a room and misses nothing that happens in it. She had no high prospects. A girl of her family and her modest gifts could expect a respectable marriage to some gentleman of her own sort, a life much like her mother's, running a country house and bearing children in the green hush of the shires. That was the future Wolf Hall held out to her, and there was nothing wrong with it. And most girls of her kind lived and died in exactly such comfortable obscurity, leaving no more trace on history than a name in a parish register. What lifted Jane out of that ordinary future was not her own ambition, as far as we can tell, but the accident of a place at court, the family's restless drive to advance its children, and then the slow, fatal turning of a king's wandering eye. She did not seek her destiny. It came looking for her. But when it came, she was ready, in a way that all her quietness had perhaps secretly prepared her for. Before we follow Jane to court, let us take a moment to look at the land she lived in, the England of her childhood and youth, because it was an age utterly unlike our own, and to understand her life, you have to feel the texture of the age around her. The England of the early 16th century was a small kingdom by the measure of the mighty continental powers, a realm of perhaps 2.5 or 3 million people, overwhelmingly rural, its life governed by the turning of the agricultural seasons and the rhythms of the old church. Most people lived, as their ancestors had lived for centuries, in villages and on the land, working the fields, tending the flocks, their horizons rarely stretching beyond the next market town. London was the one true city, growing and bustling and dirty, and full of opportunity and danger, but most of England was green and still and slow, a patchwork of fields and forests and small communities held together by the manor, the parish church, and the unchanging customs of country life. This was the England she was born into, the soft, prosperous countryside of Wiltshire, and it was the world most of her countrymen never left. It was in these years still an entirely Catholic country, woven into the fabric of the universal church that had shaped English life for 1,000 years. Each village had its church. Every life was marked from the cradle by the rituals and sacraments of the old faith, the masses and the feast days and the saints' days that gave shape and meaning to the year. The monasteries stood across the land, ancient and seemingly eternal, holding much of the country's wealth and learning and charity, their bells ringing out across the fields. To the people of Jane's childhood, this was simply how the world was and always had been and always would be, the order of things ordained by God. She was raised in this faith, conventionally devout in the way of her class, and she would remain attached to the traditional religion all her life, one of the things that may have drawn the conservative-minded among the court toward her later as a symbol of the old ways against the religious revolution that was coming. For during Jane's lifetime, that 1,000-year-old world would be torn apart, and she would live right inside the storm that tore it. Because this was the age of the upheaval, the years when Henry VIII, in pursuit of his desire to be rid of Catherine of Aragon and to marry Anne Boleyn, broke England away from the Church of Rome and set himself up as the supreme head of the Church in England. By the time she came to court, this revolution was already underway, the authority of the Pope abolished, the crown supreme over the Church, and soon the monasteries themselves would begin to fall, dissolved one by one, their lands seized, their communities scattered, their proud buildings stripped and left to crumble into the romantic ruins that still dot the English landscape today. It was the most dramatic transformation England had undergone in centuries, an earthquake that reached into every parish and every life, and it split the country between those who welcomed the new order and those who clung, often at terrible cost, to the old. She would marry the very king who was driving this revolution, and she herself was of conservative, traditional sympathies, which placed her in a delicate and interesting position, a woman of the old faith married to the man dismantling it. It is one of the subtle complexities of her story, and we will return to it. The court at the centre of this changing realm was one of the most brilliant and most dangerous places in Europe, and it is where Jane's real story begins. The Tudor court was not a single fixed place, but a vast travelling household of more than 1,000 people, moving with Henry between his many palaces, Greenwich and Richmond and Hampton Court and Whitehall and the rest, following the seasons, and fleeing the outbreaks of plague that emptied London in the warm months. It was the heart of all power, all patronage, all advancement in the kingdom. To be at court was to be near the sun, in the warmth of possible favour, where fortunes were made and lost on a royal word, where the high offices and rich rewards and advantageous marriages were all in the gift of the monarch and those around him. Every ambitious family in England wanted its children at court, in the household of the king or the queen, placed where royal favour might fall on them. It was glamorous and exciting, and saturated with opportunity. And it was lethal, a world of endless intrigue and shifting alliances and sudden catastrophic falls, where a misstep could cost you everything, including, as she would see with her own eyes, your head. It was into this realm, the brilliant and perilous heart of the realm, that the Seymours secured a place for their unassuming daughter, and it changed the course of her life and of English history. We do not know exactly when Jane first came to court, but it was probably in the late 1520s, when she was around 20, placed as a maid of honour in the royal household. A maid of honour was a young unmarried gentlewoman who attended the Queen, one of the band of well-born girls who served her, accompanied her, sat with her, danced at the court entertainments, and formed part of the glittering female society around the throne. It was a coveted position, exactly the kind of placement an ambitious gentry family schemed to obtain for a daughter, because it put her at the very centre of things, within sight of Henry and the leading men of the realm, in the prime location for catching the eye of a good husband, or, though no one would have dared to imagine it for Jane, something far greater, and the great lady whose household she entered, the first she served, the woman she would attend and observe at close quarters in these early years at court, was none other than Catherine of Aragon herself, the proud, devout, embattled Spanish queen, whose long tragedy was even then beginning to unfold. Imagine her in those first years at court, a reserved young woman from the country placed among the ladies of Catherine of Aragon, and consider what an education it must have been, not in books but in the workings of power and the precariousness of even the highest position. Her mistress was, when Jane came to serve her, still the Queen of England, the wife of more than 20 years, dignified and devout and beloved by the people, presiding over her household with the gravity of one raised from birth to wear a crown. But the ground was already shifting beneath her. The king's love had cooled and turned elsewhere. His eye had fallen on another of her own ladies, the dark and dazzling Anne Boleyn, and his conscience, that famously convenient conscience, had begun to trouble him about the validity of his marriage. The whole long crisis that we call the Great Royal Divorce was beginning, the struggle that would consume years and break the kingdom away from Rome, and the junior maid of honour had a front-row seat to its opening acts. What she made of it, we cannot know. The watchful girl from Wolf Hall, observing the proud Spanish queen fight for her marriage and her crown, and her daughter's legitimacy against the king's relentless determination to be rid of her. We cannot know, for she left no record of her thoughts, then or ever, but she watched, and she surely learned. She saw a queen who would not yield, who defied the king and the whole court, and clung to her conviction that she was Henry's true wife in the eyes of God, and she saw what that defiance cost her, the slow stripping away of her title, and her household and her comfort, the slow humiliation, the grinding pressure. She saw, in other words, what happened to a woman at this court, who stood and fought and would not bend. And she would have seen too the other side of it, the rising fortunes of the woman who had supplanted Catherine, the bold and brilliant Anne, whose refusal to be a mere mistress had set the whole crisis in motion, and who was climbing, against all odds, toward the throne itself. Two models of how a woman might deal with the king, the one who fought and lost everything, the one who schemed and dared and climbed. She watched them both. It would shape, perhaps, how she played her own hand when the impossible moment came. Catherine's loyalty Jane seems to have genuinely held. There are signs that Jane, like many at court and in the country, retained a real attachment to the wronged woman and sympathy for her cause, and that her own conservative, traditional Catholic sympathies aligned with Catherine's. This matters, because it tells us something about where Jane's heart lay, even as she served in a court increasingly dominated by the faction that wanted Catherine gone. She was not, by temperament or conviction, one of the bold reformers and ambitious schemers driving the revolution. She was a settled traditionalist who had served and perhaps loved the wronged old queen. And this would later give her own brief queenship a particular flavour, a gentleness toward the people Anne had displaced, a desire to heal the wounds the great upheaval had opened. Above all, a tenderness toward Catherine's abandoned daughter Mary, which would become one of the few places where Jane used her influence as queen, and used it kindly, but all that lay ahead. In these first years, she was simply one of the Queen's ladies, going about the ordinary round of court life, attending the first of Henry's wives through the slow agony of her displacement. She watched at close quarters as that proud and dignified woman was set aside, as the king's love cooled and turned elsewhere, as the whole settled order of the court was torn up to make room for another. It was an extraordinary thing for a young woman to witness, the unmaking of a queen, and it taught her, surely, lessons she would carry for the rest of her life about the heights and the perils of the place she had come to. Let me take you closer into those years in Catherine of Aragon's household, because to have watched that proud woman in that particular season was an education in the precariousness of greatness that no book could have given her. Catherine was the daughter of the sovereigns of Spain, raised by a warrior mother to wear a crown herself, devout and dignified and utterly certain of her own rightness. And she had held her place for 20 years, and could not conceive of being anything but its sovereign. Yet even as Jane joined her ladies, the ground beneath that certainty was crumbling. Picture the young attendant among them, quiet and watchful, waiting on the formidable Spaniard through the slow ordeal of her displacement, with a front-row seat to the dignified, agonizing unmaking of a great woman, learning, surely, lessons she would never forget. For she would not yield. That was the heart of her, the iron at her core, and it was the thing that destroyed her. The king wanted to be rid of her, wanted his marriage declared void so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, and he expected her to do the graceful, convenient thing, to accept an annulment and retire quietly to a convent with her dignity intact, as royal wives had done before her. And she refused, insisting with absolute and unshakable conviction that she was the king's true and lawful wife in the eyes of God and the Church, that nothing on earth could undo a marriage that heaven had joined, and that she would die before she would lie about it, or abandon her position, or bastardize her beloved daughter. She fought the king to a standstill with nothing but her conviction and her dignity, and she paid for it, across years, with the slow stripping away of everything she had, her husband's love, her place at court, her title, her household, her comfort, and at the last her daughter and her freedom. She witnessed all of this. She saw a queen stand and fight and refuse to bend, and she saw what that defiance cost, the long humiliation, the grinding pressure, the cold and lonely houses to which Catherine was eventually banished, the cruel separation from her daughter, the slow death in exile. And she would have drawn her own conclusions, the watchful girl from Wolf Hall, about what happened to a woman at this court who stood her ground and would not yield. It is one of the strange ironies of Jane's story that she learned from the tragic example of Catherine the very lesson that would shape her own queenship, which was that defiance was fatal, that the way to survive was not to fight the king, but to give him what he wanted. Catherine fought and was destroyed. Jane, when her own time came, would not fight. She would obey and serve exactly as her motto promised, and she would survive where the woman she had served as a girl had not. And there was, beneath the lesson in survival, something gentler that she took from those years, a genuine sympathy for the wronged old queen and her cause, and above all for her daughter. Jane seems to have kept a real attachment to her old mistress, and to the traditional faith that she embodied, and she watched the cruel treatment of the Princess Mary with a compassion that would later, when she herself came to the throne, move her to act. Those years in service were not merely a cold political education in the dangers of defiance. They were also, it seems, a moral one, a witnessing of injustice that left its mark on her conscience, and that would show itself when she had the power, in her patient efforts to heal the wounds that had been opened, to bring the rejected princess back into her father's favour, to do some small good for the family she had watched suffer. She learned hard lessons in those rooms, but she learned tender ones too, and both would shape the queen she became. To serve Anne Boleyn cannot have been easy or comfortable, for Anne was a difficult mistress, sharp-tongued and quick-tempered, and increasingly anxious as her own position grew precarious. Anne had won Henry by being everything Catherine was not: brilliant and bold and exciting, and for a time she had shone at the very heart of the court, crowned at last after years of struggle, the mother of the king's daughter Elizabeth. But Anne, like the first queen before her, had failed to give him the living son he craved above all things, and as the months passed, and the longed-for prince did not come, and as Anne miscarried and his ardour cooled, and his eye began once more to wander, Anne grew frightened and sharp and difficult, lashing out, quarrelling, sensing the ground shifting beneath her as it had once shifted beneath the woman she replaced. And among the ladies who served this increasingly anxious mistress, watching, careful and still, was Jane Seymour, who by some accounts Anne came to regard with suspicion and dislike, for reasons that would soon become all too clear. The king had begun to notice her, and then there were the years serving Anne Boleyn, which must have been stranger and more uncomfortable still, and which deserve a closer look, because she spent them in the household of the very woman she would replace, watching the second proud consort of Henry's reign rise and blaze and begin, even then, to fall. When Catherine was finally pushed aside and Anne rose to take her place, the royal household reformed itself around its new centre, and Jane, like many of the ladies, found herself transferred from the service of the old mistress to the service of the new. So Jane now waited on Anne Boleyn, the dark and dazzling woman who had supplanted Catherine, attended her, served in her household, was one of the band of ladies around her throne, in the years before his eye would turn from Anne to Jane herself, exactly as it had once turned from the first queen to Anne. The pattern repeated like an image in facing mirrors, each queen undone by a lady of her own household, and she stood at the very heart of the second turning of that terrible wheel. And what a school that household was for a watchful young woman. Anne's court was a different realm from the one Jane had first entered, brilliant and sharp and charged with a restless energy that flowed from its mistress. Where the Spanish queen had presided with grave dignity, Anne presided with French-polished wit, demanding and quick and dazzling, surrounding herself with music and poetry and flirtation, and the constant glitter of high fashion. It was a court that prized cleverness and boldness and display, where a woman made her mark by shining, by being seen and heard and admired. And Jane, quiet and plain and watchful among all that brilliance, must have understood very clearly that she could never compete on those terms, that whatever path she might one day find to safety or fortune, it would not be the path of dazzle that Anne had taken. The lesson of how to rise by brilliance was on display all around her. So, increasingly, was the lesson of how brilliance, once the king's favour cooled, could curdle into danger, for by the time Jane had settled into Anne's service, the second queen's own position was beginning, quietly. To slip to serve such a mistress cannot have been easy or comfortable, and Jane, by some accounts, came to be regarded by Anne with suspicion and dislike, for reasons that would soon become clear. There is a story, impossible to verify, but too telling to omit, of Anne discovering Jane and the king together, or discovering some token of the king's growing interest, and reacting with the fury and fear of a woman who could see her own fate approaching in the person of her watchful, observant lady-in-waiting. Whether the specific stories are true, the underlying situation surely was the rising tension between the anxious queen and the modest maid of honour who had caught the king's eye, the older drama replaying itself with new players, and now cast in the role that Catherine had once played, the wife being displaced, and Jane in the role that Anne had once played, the lady-in-waiting who would take her place. Anne, of all people, would have understood exactly what was happening, having done it herself, and the knowledge must have been a particular torment. What she felt serving this doomed and frightened queen, knowing as she surely came to know that she was the instrument of Anne's coming fall, we can only imagine. We cannot say, for she left no word, as she left no word of anything. But she was no longer by this point an innocent bystander. She was the king's quarry, and increasingly his willing prize, courted by Henry even as Anne's position crumbled, and she played her part in the unfolding drama with the careful skill we have seen. She had watched Catherine fall and Anne rise. Now she watched Anne fall and herself rise, the whole brutal machinery of royal favour and royal destruction turning once more, and this time turning to lift her up. She served Anne to the end of Anne's brief reign, one of the ladies of a household that was about to be destroyed, until the spring of 1536, when the machinery closed around Anne and carried her to the Tower and the scaffold, and Jane stepped out of the doomed queen's shadow and into the king's waiting arms. It is a vertiginous thing to contemplate, the reserved woman moving from the service of one destroyed queen to the service of the next, and then into the throne herself, and she lived it and kept her own counsel through all of it, and gave nothing away. Let us pause here and picture what Jane's daily life was actually like in these years, the texture of her days as a maid of honour, because it is easy to speak of service at court in the abstract and miss the lived reality of it. The life of a maid of honour was not the idle glamour we might imagine from a distance. It was a demanding, structured, exhausting existence, lived almost entirely on display, in close and constant attendance on the Queen. The day began early, with the maids helping to dress and prepare the Queen, an elaborate ritual involving the layered and complicated clothing of a high lady, the gowns and kirtles and sleeves and headdresses, each piece requiring assistance. There were the religious observances that framed the day, the masses, and the prayers, for the court ran on the rhythms of the church. There was attendance on her mistress through her day, accompanying her, sitting with her at her needlework and her devotions, and her receiving of visitors, being always present, always available, always correct in manner and bearing. And there were the evenings, which were the court's true theatre, the dancing and the music and the games, the elaborate entertainments and masks that the Tudors loved, the gambling at cards and dice, the whole glittering social performance through which the court conducted its real business of flirtation and alliance and intrigue. A maid of honour was expected to shine in this setting, to dance gracefully, to make pleasant conversation, to be ornamental and charming, for the female society around the Queen was part of the court's display and part of its marriage market. The maids were, in a real sense, on show young unmarried gentlewomen of good family, their reputations and their prospects under constant observation, each of them hoping that her time at court would end in a good marriage to some gentleman or lord who had noticed her across the candle-lit hall. It was glamorous and it was relentless, a performance that never quite ended, conducted under the watchful eyes of a court that noticed all and forgave nothing. For a young woman, the court was a place of opportunity and of danger braided tightly together, and the danger was very real. A maid of honour's reputation was her fortune, her one true asset, and it could be lost in an evening to a rumour, true or false, that she could never afterward outrun. The men of the court pursued the women relentlessly, in the elaborate and often insincere language of courtly love, and a young woman had to navigate this with utmost care, accepting admiration without surrendering her virtue, charming without compromising herself, keeping her reputation spotless in an environment designed to test it. The stakes were enormous. A girl who managed it well might make a brilliant marriage. A girl who slipped might be ruined forever, sent home in disgrace, her prospects destroyed. Jane, by every sign, navigated this treacherous world with consummate skill, keeping herself quiet and modest and above reproach, giving the gossips nothing, building exactly the reputation for unimpeachable virtue that would, when the decisive moment came, prove the most valuable thing she possessed. And this is the point worth dwelling on, because it is so easily missed. Jane's reputation for virtue was not an accident, not merely the natural overflow of a colourless personality. In the context of that court, it was an achievement, the product of years of careful, disciplined self-management in an environment that destroyed the careless. To emerge from a decade as a maid of honour at the court of Henry VIII, with a reputation utterly unblemished, with no scandal, no whisper, no misstep that anyone could point to, was not nothing. It was the mark of a woman who understood exactly how dangerous her world was, and who had governed herself accordingly, with a control and a foresight that the legend of the passive, empty Jane entirely misses. She had watched what happened to women who were bold. She had chosen, whether by nature or by calculation or by both, to be the opposite, and she had executed that choice flawlessly across years of temptation and danger. When the king's eye finally fell on her, what he saw was a woman of spotless reputation, modest and virtuous and undemanding, and that spotlessness was the foundation of everything that followed. It was, you might say, the thing she had been building all along, that though she could not have known what it was building toward. It is worth dwelling on what the court meant for a young woman like Jane in the ordinary way of things, before fortune singled her out, because it illuminates how astonishing her eventual fate truly was. A maid of honour came to court, fundamentally, to make a good marriage. That was the practical purpose of the position, beneath all its glamour and ceremony. An ambitious family placed a daughter in the Queen's household to put her in the path of advancement, in the company of the powerful men and eligible bachelors of the realm, where she might catch the eye of a suitable husband, and so secure both her own future and a useful connection for her family. The court was, among everything else it was, a busy marriage market, and the young unmarried gentlewomen who served the Queen were, in a sense, on display in that market, their reputations and their charms and their family connections all under appraisal by the men who might marry them. There is one small mystery in these years that is worth pausing on, because it tells us something, though we cannot be sure what. Jane remained unmarried into her late 20s, which was distinctly old for a woman of her time and station to be still unwed. Most daughters of the gentry were matched and married off in their teens or early 20s, their unions arranged by families keen to seal alliances and settle their daughters. Yet for Jane, no such match was made year after year, and she lingered at court, a maid of honour growing quietly older among younger girls. Historians have puzzled over it, and we can only guess at the reasons. Perhaps she was thought too plain or too poor to attract the offers a more dazzling or better dowered rival might have drawn. Perhaps her family, with their eyes on advancement, were holding out for something better than her modest charms could easily command. Whatever the cause, the long delay meant that Jane was still unattached, still at court, still within reach of the king's eye, at the very moment when, against every expectation, that eye began to turn her way, and this is what makes her actual fate so utterly extraordinary, so far beyond anything the marriage market could ever have produced for her. The ordinary maid of honour hoped to marry a gentleman. She married the king. The ordinary maid of honour hoped to become the mistress of a country house. She became the mistress of England. The leap from what she might realistically have expected to what she actually achieved is so vast as to be almost incomprehensible, a once-in-a-kingdom transformation that no calculation could have predicted, and no ambition could reasonably have aimed at. The plain girl who might have struggled to find any husband at all became the wife of the most powerful man in the realm, the queen of the country, the mother of the heir. It was the marriage market gone mad, the most modest of prizes claiming the very greatest of all. And it happened not because she was the most beautiful, or the most brilliant, or the most marriageable of the court's young women, but because she was, by chance and by her own quiet skill, exactly what one particular weary king happened to want at one particular moment. There is a lesson in it, of a sort, about the role of pure fortune in human affairs, the way that a life can be utterly transformed by an accident of timing and circumstance entirely beyond anyone's planning. Had Jane come to court at a different moment, had the king's eye not happened to fall on her precisely when he was sickening of Anne, had she been a little less skilled in her response, or a little less spotless in her reputation, she would have remained what she was, an obscure maid of honour who married, or did not marry, some gentleman, and vanished from history without a trace, like the thousands of other young women who served and married and died unrecorded. Instead, by the strangest of chances, she became a queen, and the mother of a king, and the wife who lies beside Henry VIII at Windsor through all the centuries. The marriage market that was supposed to find her a country gentleman found her a throne. It was the most extraordinary stroke of fortune, and it killed her, and it made her immortal. Now we come to the turning, the moment when the obscure maid of honour stepped out of the background of history and into its glare, and it came in the early months of the year 1536, the year that would compress into a few astonishing months the fall of one queen and the rise of another. By this time, Anne Boleyn's position was crumbling. She had failed to give the king his son, had miscarried in the January of that year of a male child, the prince who might have saved her, and the king's love had curdled into resentment, and his eye had begun to rove, and it roved, with a terrible symmetry, to one of Anne's own ladies, the modest Seymour girl, just as it had once roved from Catherine to Anne herself. Exactly when Henry's interest in Jane began, we cannot say with certainty, but by the early spring of 1536 it was unmistakable, and it was already something more than the ordinary wandering of a king's fancy. Henry had begun to court her, and the manner of his courting, and the manner of her response, would reveal that this was no idle dalliance but the opening of a deliberate campaign that would end with Jane on the throne and Anne in her grave. To understand why Henry turned to Jane, you have to understand what the king had become by 1536 and what he was longing for. He was no longer the golden young prince who had married Catherine of Aragon in the bloom of his youth, nor even the ardent, obsessive lover who had torn the kingdom apart to win Anne Boleyn. He was a man in his mid-40s now, heavier, aging, his body beginning to fail him, soured by years of marital strife and disappointment, increasingly suspicious and self-pitying and dangerous. He had had 2 wives who were, each in her way, formidable, strong-willed women who engaged him, challenged him, argued with him, made his life a drama of high passion and higher conflict. Catherine had defied him with the immovable conviction of a woman who believed God was on her side. Anne had matched his fire with her own, brilliant and sharp and quarrelsome, their marriage a series of storms. And Henry, worn down by all of it, aging and aching and tired, had come to long for something entirely different, something soft and soothing and undemanding, a wife who would not argue or defy or challenge him, but would simply, restfully obey. And there, among Anne's own ladies, stood exactly that wife, or so she appeared to him, the gentle, modest Jane Seymour, the very opposite of the dark and dangerous queen he had come to resent. Where Anne was sharp, she was soft. Where Anne was brilliant and quick, she was calm and slow and undemanding. Where Anne challenged and quarrelled, Jane deferred and soothed. Where Anne was all fire and edges, she was all mildness and yielding. To a man exhausted by storms, she must have seemed like still water, like rest, like peace itself. The very qualities that made Jane unremarkable in the dazzling competition of the court, her quietness, her plainness, her lack of brilliance, were transformed in the king's tired and longing eye into exactly the virtues he now craved in a wife. He looked at Jane and saw not a dim provincial girl, but a haven, a refuge from the years of conflict, the gentle and obedient companion his weary heart desired. It was in its way a love born of exhaustion, the longing of a difficult, aging man for the easy comfort that his brilliant, difficult wives had never given him. We should look harder at the man she married, the king as he was in 1536, because so much of her story is really the story of what Henry VIII had become by then, and the king of that year was a very different creature from the Golden Prince of legend. Cast your mind back to what Henry had once been, in the bright years of his youth, when he married Catherine of Aragon. He had been one of the most impressive men in Europe, tall and athletic and handsome, a superb horseman and tireless hunter, a jouster of reckless courage, a musician and scholar and sportsman who seemed to embody everything a Renaissance prince should be. He had been charming, generous, beloved, golden, the very picture of magnificent young kingship. But that was a quarter of a century before she came into his view, and the years had not been kind to him, and the man she married was a wreck of that golden youth, aging and ailing and soured into something far darker and more dangerous. By 1536 Henry was in his mid-40s, and his once magnificent body was failing him. He had grown heavy, his athletic frame thickening toward the vast bulk of his final years. He suffered from a chronic ulcer on his leg, an open wound that would not heal, that caused him constant pain and sometimes stank, that flared and discharged and tormented him, a misery that would plague him for the rest of his life. And in January of that very year, 1536, he had suffered a terrible accident in the jousting yard, a heavy fall in full armour that knocked him unconscious for what was said to be 2 hours, an injury so severe that those around him feared for his life. He survived, but he was never quite the same after it, and some have wondered whether the fall did lasting damage, whether the increasingly suspicious, volatile, cruel king of the later years was in some measure the product of that blow to the head. Certainly the accident, coming when it did, marked a turning, the moment when the aging, injured, pain-racked king began his final descent into the tyrannical and frightening figure of his last decade. This was the man who turned his eye to Jane Seymour, and understanding his condition helps us understand his longing. He was aging and in pain, and increasingly aware of his own mortality, haunted by the failure to secure his dynasty with a son, soured by 2 marriages that had each ended in conflict and grief. He had lost the golden ease of his youth, and with it, perhaps, much of his patience and his generosity, and his capacity for the give and take of a real partnership. What he wanted now was not a brilliant equal or a passionate obsession, but simple comfort, peace, an undemanding wife who would soothe and serve and never challenge him, who would give him the son he craved and ask nothing difficult in return. He was a difficult, aging, dangerous, self-pitying man, and he longed for the easy balm of a gentle wife, and in Jane he thought he had found it. The relationship has to be understood in this light, as the longing of a declining man for comfort and an heir, not the grand passion of his youth, but something quieter and needier, and in its way, sadder. And it helps us understand, too, the hard edge that lay always beneath Henry's affection, the edge that she would feel when she knelt to beg for the rebels and was sharply rebuked. For this was a man growing more dangerous by the year, more suspicious, more volatile, more willing to destroy those who displeased him. He had just had his second wife beheaded on charges that were almost certainly false. He had broken a mighty cardinal, executed a saintly chancellor, was even then beginning to scatter the monasteries, and would soon be drowning a vast rebellion in blood. The king she married was capable of terrible things, and was becoming more capable of them with every passing year, and his affection for his gentle new wife, real as it was, rested always on the understanding that she would stay as he wished her. Jane, watchful and shrewd, surely understood the nature of the man she had married, understood the danger beneath the fondness, and governed herself accordingly, quiet and obedient and careful, never to rouse the darkness she had seen him turn on others. She had married a failing, dangerous king who longed for comfort and would brook no defiance, and she gave him the comfort and offered no defiance, and so she kept herself safe for the little time she had. We should be honest, though, about what this relationship was and was not, because it is easy to romanticize it into something it was not. This was not the grand passion that Henry had felt for Anne, the years of obsessive, helpless desire that had driven him to remake a kingdom. There are no surviving love letters from Henry to Jane to compare with the famous letters he wrote to Anne in the fever of his pursuit. What Henry felt for Jane seems to have been something quieter and in some ways more comfortable, a fondness, an affection, a sense of relief and ease and rightness, the contentment of a tired man who has found what he thinks he wants. He was kind to her, attentive, generous, and he seems to have been genuinely fond of her. But it was a relationship of a fundamentally unequal and conditional kind, the king's affection resting always on Jane being what he wanted her to be, soft and obedient and untroubling, and on her giving him the one thing he needed above all else. She was not Henry's equal partner, as Catherine had briefly been in the early years, nor his obsession, as Anne had been. She was his comfort and his hope, valued for the peace she brought, and the son she might bear, and the affection, real as it was, had hard limits that she would learn to respect. And Jane, for her part, played the situation with a skill and a control that should finally lay to rest any notion that she was a mere passive nothing. She understood, surely, the extraordinary and perilous nature of what was happening. The most powerful man in England was courting her while still married to a queen who sat, for now, upon the throne. She had watched from close quarters exactly this situation unfold once before, when he had courted Anne while still married to Catherine, and she knew how it had gone, knew the danger and the opportunity in equal measure, and she made a choice that was either the product of her own shrewd calculation or the coaching of her ambitious family, or most likely both, a choice that was bold and risky and brilliantly judged. She would not become the king's mistress. She would refuse him, exactly as Anne had once done, holding out for marriage and the crown or nothing at all. It was an audacious gamble to refuse the most dangerous man in England, but she, or the men advising her, had learned the lesson of Anne's success well. The way to the throne was not through the bed, but through the withholding of it. And so the modest, undemanding Jane set about, with perfect control, denying him the thing he wanted, and thereby making him want it, and her, all the more. The most famous moment of this campaign, the scene that has come down to us as the very emblem of Jane's strategy, came when Henry sent her a gift. Henry sent her a purse full of gold coins along with a letter, an opening move in the courtly game, the kind of present a man sent to a woman he was pursuing, and Jane, instead of accepting it, did something that was either deeply pious or deeply calculated, or, again, both at once. She refused the gift. She kissed the letter, but returned it unopened, and she sent back the purse of gold untouched, and she fell to her knees before the messenger, and declared that she was a gentlewoman of good and honourable family, that she had nothing in the world but her honour, which she would not injure for 1,000 deaths, and that, if he wished to make her a present of money, she begged he would do so, when God might send her a good and honourable marriage. It was a masterstroke. It was in fact almost exactly the move that Anne Boleyn had made a decade before, the same insistence on honour, the same refusal of the mistress's role, the same dangled promise of something more than dalliance. She had studied her predecessor's playbook, consciously or not, and she ran it to perfection, and the effect on him was precisely what it had been before. The refusal inflamed him, the withholding made him want her all the more, and it transformed Jane, in his mind, from a possible mistress into a possible wife. But there was a profound and terrible difference between Anne's situation a decade before and Jane's now, and it casts a long dark shadow over the whole of Jane's courtship, one that we cannot honestly look away from. When Anne had refused to be Henry's mistress, the king had been married to Catherine, and to free himself he had been forced into the grinding public struggle of the annulment, the years of legal wrangling, and the eventual break with Rome. It had taken the better part of a decade, and Catherine, though stripped of her crown, had lived. But by 1536 Henry had learned, or his ministers had learned for him, that there were faster ways to be rid of an inconvenient wife. While Henry courted her, the machinery was already turning that would destroy Anne Boleyn, not through the slow uncertainty of annulment, but through the swift brutality of the scaffold. Anne would be accused of adultery, of treason, of incest with her own brother, charges almost certainly false, assembled by the king's minister Thomas Cromwell with cold and deadly efficiency. She would be arrested, tried, condemned, and beheaded, all within the space of a few weeks, in the spring of 1536, even as the king pursued her replacement. And here is the fact that we cannot soften, the fact that hangs over Jane's rise and complicates any simple sympathy for her. Henry's courtship of Jane and the destruction of Anne were happening at the same time. As Anne was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower, as she was tried and condemned, as she waited for the sword that would end her life, the king was openly courting Jane Seymour, making arrangements for their future, behaving like a man freed of an encumbrance, and eager for his new happiness. He had Jane lodged nearby, sent her messages, planned for what would come after. He was, by some accounts, in high and cheerful spirits during the very days of Anne's imprisonment and trial, dining out, enjoying himself, the picture of a man whose troubles were about to be solved, and she was the solution, the waiting bride, the reward at the end of the bloody business. There is something genuinely chilling in it. The courtship conducted in the shadow of the scaffold, the new love blossoming while the old wife was killed to make room for it. Whatever she felt about it, and we do not know, for she left no word, she was the beneficiary of a judicial murder, and she married the man who had ordered it, with the blood barely dry. We should be careful and fair to Jane here, because the temptation is either to condemn her as complicit or to excuse her as helpless, and the truth is probably somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. She did not arrange Anne's destruction. That was the work of the king and Cromwell and the larger political forces of the moment, in which a mere maid of honour had no real hand. She was a piece moved on the board, valuable to the king and to her ambitious family precisely as the instrument of her replacement, and the degree to which she actively schemed, as opposed to simply being deployed and going along, we cannot measure. She may have felt she had no choice. To refuse a king's love was itself a dangerous act, To stand in the path of the vast machine that was destroying Anne and lifting her up would have taken a courage and an independence that few people of any station possessed in that court. But neither was she merely an innocent bystander, swept along against her will. She accepted the king's courtship, played her part with skill, returned the purse with that perfectly judged speech, allowed herself to be made the symbol and reward of Anne's fall, and married the king with unseemly haste. Once the deed was done, she was not the author of the tragedy, but she was not untouched by it either. She profited from a killing, and that is part of her story, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The haste, when it came, was breathtaking, and it tells you everything about the king's eagerness and the cold efficiency of the whole business. Anne Boleyn was executed on the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, beheaded by a swordsman brought from France, within the walls of the Tower of London. And the very next day, the 20th of May, the day after Anne's head fell, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. The day after. The king did not wait a week, did not wait a decent interval, did not pause even for the appearance of mourning or propriety. The wife was dead one morning, and the betrothal to her successor was sealed the next. And then, with the same indecent speed, they were married, quietly, on the 30th of May, just 11 days after Anne's execution. 11 days. In less than a fortnight, Henry had executed one wife and married the next. It is one of the most extraordinary and revealing sequences in the whole history of the English monarchy, and it lays bare, with brutal clarity, both the king's eagerness for his new bride and the chilling disposability of the women in his life. Anne was barely cold when she took her place, and the court, which had watched one queen die, turned at once to celebrate the next, the wheel turning so fast it must have made them dizzy. So Jane Seymour became Queen of England, married to the king in a quiet ceremony at the palace, raised in a matter of weeks from a maid of honour of no particular consequence to the consort of the most powerful man in the realm. There was no grand coronation procession through London as there had been for Anne, no spectacle of triumph, and the reasons for this are debated. Perhaps the haste, perhaps the king's caution, perhaps a plan to crown her only once she had proven herself by bearing a son, a coronation she would not live to receive. But crowned or not, she was the queen, and the transformation in her life and her family's was total. The unassuming girl from Wolf Hall was now the first lady of the kingdom, and her brothers Edward and Thomas were swept up in her wake into the highest circles of power, the whole Seymour clan elevated in an instant by the marriage of its modest daughter. And Henry, for his part, was happy, or as happy as that difficult man ever was, content at last with his soft and obedient wife, freed of the storms of his second marriage, his hopes fixed now on the son that his gentle new wife would surely, please God, finally give him. Let us pause on the wedding itself and the strange quietness that surrounded Jane's elevation, because it tells us something about her position and about the mood of that grim spring. There was no grand public spectacle for Jane, none of the dazzling display that had marked Anne Boleyn's coronation 3 years before, when Anne had been carried through London in a blaze of pageantry, crowned with the crown of kings in Westminster Abbey, amid sullen, silent crowds. She was married quietly, in a private ceremony at one of the royal palaces, with little fanfare, the king's third wedding conducted with none of the triumph of his second, and she was never crowned at all. A coronation was planned, talked of, intended, but it kept being postponed, put off from one date to another, and in the end it never happened, for she did not live long enough to receive it. She was queen for some 17 months, and was never given the crown in the solemn ceremony at the Abbey that her predecessors had received. Why this was, we cannot fully know, and historians have offered various explanations. Some say it was the haste and the awkwardness of the circumstances, the unseemly speed with which she had succeeded the beheaded Anne, that made a grand celebration feel inappropriate. Some say it was caution, the king's wish to see whether his new wife would prove herself by bearing a son before he invested in the enormous expense and display of a coronation. Some point to outbreaks of plague that made large public gatherings in London dangerous. Perhaps it was all of these together. But whatever the reason, the effect was that Jane occupied her throne without the ultimate ceremonial confirmation of it, queen in fact and in title, but never crowned, her position resting entirely on the king's favour and her hope of bearing him an heir, never sealed by the sacred ritual that had anointed Catherine and Anne. There is something poignant in it, the uncrowned queen raised so high and yet never given the final mark of her station, as though even at the summit her position retained a kind of provisionality, a sense that everything depended on what was still to come. What came, in the months after the wedding, was the calm settling of the new consort into her role, the establishment of the more decorous court that reflected her nature, the slow turning of the king's hopes toward the heir she might provide. The contrast with Anne's reign was deliberate and total. Where Anne's court had been brilliant and turbulent and French in its fashions, Jane's was restrained and traditional and English. Where Anne had been a political force pushing her religious views and making enemies and quarrelling with the king, she was quiet and submissive and careful, bound to obey and serve. The court that had been a battlefield under Anne became, under Jane, a place of calm, and Henry, by all accounts, was content with the change, settling into the comfortable domesticity he had craved, his gentle new wife asking nothing and troubling him not at all. It was, in its quiet way, a kind of golden interlude in the king's stormy marital history, this brief period of peace between the execution of Anne and the death of Jane, the one stretch of Henry's middle years that was not marked by marital conflict and catastrophe. For a little while, Henry had what he wanted, a peaceful court and an obedient wife, and the prospect of an heir, and she had what she had climbed to obtain, the throne and the royal favour, and the chance to secure her position forever by giving him a son. It could not last, of course. Nothing in that king's life lasted, and this least of all, for it would end with Jane's death, in the very act of providing the heir that was its whole purpose. But for those few months, in the calm after the storm of Anne's fall, and before the catastrophe of Jane's death, there was a settled contentment running through the English court. The difficult aging Henry and his soft obedient queen settled together in the peace he had long desired, waiting, hopefully, for the child who would make everything complete. When she became queen, she chose a motto, as such women did, a personal device that would be displayed and embroidered and carved as her emblem, and her choice tells us much about how she understood her own position and how deliberately she set out to be the opposite of the woman she had replaced. Her motto was, "Bound to obey and serve." Bound to obey and serve. Consider those words, and consider them against the background of what had just happened. Anne Boleyn had been brilliant, bold, defiant, a consort who argued and quarrelled and challenged, and she had ended on the scaffold, accused of betraying and conspiring against the king. And here was her successor, choosing as the very emblem of her queenship a declaration of submission, a promise to obey and to serve, to be the docile and dutiful wife that Anne had so conspicuously failed to be. It was a statement of intent, a deliberate positioning, a message to the king and the court that this wife, unlike the last, knew her place and meant to keep it, whether it came from Jane's own nature, or from her shrewd reading of what had destroyed her predecessor, or from the coaching of her watchful family. It was exactly the right note to strike, and Jane struck it perfectly. This was the relationship as Henry wanted it, and she gave it to him with apparent willingness and considerable skill. She became the model of the submissive, supportive, undemanding wife, the soothing presence the king had longed for through the storms of his earlier marriages. She did not argue with him. She did not challenge his policies or push her own views, at least not openly, not in the manner that had helped destroy Anne. She kept herself quiet and pleasant and accommodating, presiding over a calmer and more decorous court than the one Anne had kept, dressing more modestly, behaving more demurely, setting a tone of dignified restraint after the brilliant turbulence of her predecessor. She reversed Anne's French fashions, bringing back the more traditional English styles, a small but telling signal of the return to older and steadier ways. She was, in every visible respect, exactly what she had promised to be, bound to obey and serve, and the king, by all accounts, was pleased and content, settled at last into the comfortable domesticity he had craved. And yet we should not mistake this submission for weakness or emptiness, because there are signs that beneath the obedient surface she was quietly, carefully using what influence she had, choosing her moments, picking the one or two causes that mattered to her and pursuing them with a gentle persistence that worked precisely because it never threatened the king. The submission was real, but it was also, in part, a strategy, the only viable strategy for a woman in her position, who had seen what happened to queens who pushed too hard. She had learned the lesson of Anne's fall in the most vivid possible way, and she governed herself accordingly. She would not make Anne's mistakes. She would not be conspicuous, would not quarrel, would not make herself a political force that Henry and his ministers might come to fear and resent. She would be quiet and dutiful and safe, and from that position of safety she would do the small good that she could, gently, without ever appearing to overreach. It was the wisdom of a woman who understood her age exactly, and it kept her, for the brief time she had, secure in the king's favour, where her predecessors had ended in tragedy. There is a danger in telling Jane's story this way, of making her sound merely cunning, a calculating player working the angles, and that would be as false as the legend of the empty vessel. The truth seems to be that Jane's gentleness was genuine, rooted in her real nature, and that her quietness and modesty and kindness were not mere performance, but the actual qualities of a decent and unassuming woman. What made her remarkable was that these real qualities happened to be exactly what the moment required, and that she had the wit to understand their value and to deploy them with care. She was not a schemer pretending to be gentle. She was a gentle woman who was also shrewd enough to know that her gentleness was her strength, and disciplined enough to maintain it under the enormous pressure of her position. The two things, the genuine kindness and the careful strategy, coexisted in her as they do in many people, and it is the combination that makes her interesting, far more interesting than either the saint or the schemer of the simpler tellings. And there was one cause above all, where Jane's genuine kindness and her quiet influence came together to do real good, and it is perhaps the most attractive thing in her whole story, the thing that lifts her above mere survival and shows us the decency at the heart of her. It concerned the king's elder daughter, Mary, the child of Catherine of Aragon, who had been so cruelly treated through the years of her parents' marital catastrophe. Mary had been declared illegitimate, stripped of her title of princess, separated from her dying mother, bullied and threatened and humiliated, forced at last to acknowledge her own bastardy and her father's supremacy over the church, a capitulation wrung from a frightened and isolated young woman who had lost everything. By the time she became queen, Mary was a sad and broken figure, estranged from her father, her position precarious, her future bleak, and Jane, who had served Mary's mother Catherine in the old days, and retained her sympathy for that wronged family, set herself to heal the breach, to bring father and daughter back together, to restore poor Mary to some measure of favour and security. It was the one place where the obedient queen gently pushed, and it was pushing in the direction of mercy. Jane's efforts on Mary's behalf were persistent and, in the end, partly successful, and they reveal a woman willing to use her precious and fragile influence for someone else's good rather than merely her own advancement. She interceded with the king gently and repeatedly, urging him toward reconciliation with his daughter, pressing Mary's cause in the soft and unthreatening way that was her method. She is said to have spoken to Henry on Mary's behalf, to have worked to soften his anger, to have encouraged the restoration of the broken relationship between father and child. And though the king was slow and the path was not smooth, and though Mary first had to make her painful submission before Henry would relent, her advocacy helped to bring about a real reconciliation. The princess was received back at court, restored to her father's favour, brought back into the family from the cold exile to which the years of crisis had banished her, and a genuine warmth seems to have grown between Jane and her stepdaughter, who was in fact not so very much younger than the Queen herself, a bond between two women who had both, in their different ways, been shaped by the long tragedy of Catherine of Aragon. It is a small thing in the vast sweep of Tudor history, but it is a good thing, an act of kindness in a court not famous for kindness, and it is to Jane's lasting credit. To feel the full weight of what Jane did, it helps to remember just how far Mary had fallen, once the cherished only child of the king, the heir to the throne, raised from the cradle to rule one day. She had watched her entire world collapse when her father set her mother aside. The cruelest stroke of all came when she was made to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman who had displaced her own mother, a deliberate humiliation few could have borne with grace. And the submission that was finally wrung from her, the signed acknowledgement of her own illegitimacy and her father's supremacy over the church, was a capitulation she would regret with bitter anguish for the rest of her life. This was the broken young woman, not so much younger than Jane herself, whose cause the new queen now quietly took up. The warmth between them showed itself most touchingly at the christening of Jane's son, the little Prince Edward, where Mary stood as godmother to the half-brother whose very birth pushed her further from the throne. There is no sign that she resented the child or his mother for it. On the contrary, she seems to have found in the gentle third wife something she had been starved of for years, a kindness, a friend, a measure of the security and affection she had lost, and the two remained close in the short time that was left to them. It is a small moment in the vast sweep of these events, but a true and human one, and it shows us a side of Jane that the cold legend of the dull wife entirely misses. When she died, Mary was among the chief mourners, and she grieved for the stepmother who had been kind to her in her darkness, and she never forgot it. Years later, when Mary herself at last came to the throne, she would honour Jane's memory and maintain her connection to the Seymour family, remembering the Queen who had reached out to a broken girl and helped to bring her home. It is a modest thing in the vast sweep of Tudor history, this kindness between two women, but it is a real thing and a good thing, and it tells us more about who Jane truly was than all the speculation about her relationship with the king. In a court not famous for kindness, in an age not famous for mercy, Jane Seymour used her brief and precious moment of influence to do good to a suffering girl who had no other friend, and that act of compassion is, perhaps, the finest monument she left behind, finer than the son who became a king, finer than the tomb she shares with Henry at Windsor, the simple human kindness of a gentle woman to a broken one. In this, and in her general disposition, Jane represented something that many in England longed for after the upheavals of the previous decade, a return to gentleness, to tradition, to the healing of wounds. She was of conservative and old-fashioned sympathies, attached to the old religion, inclined toward mercy and reconciliation rather than revolution and punishment. To the many people in the kingdom who had been distressed by the break with Rome, by the dissolution of the monasteries that was now beginning in earnest, by the whole violent transformation of their world, she seemed to offer a hope, however faint, of moderation, a queen who might gently incline the king back toward the old ways and the old mercies. She was a symbol, to those who wished it, of the possibility that the storms might pass and a calmer, more traditional order might be restored. How much real influence she had over the weighty matters of religion and state is doubtful, probably very little, for these were not areas where a queen of Jane's careful temperament would dare to push hard. But she was a focus for the hopes of the conservative-minded, and her gentle presence at the king's side was, for them, a reassurance. To understand the world in which Jane reigned, we have to understand the vast religious upheaval that was reaching its height during her brief queenship, because it formed the backdrop to everything, and because Jane, the traditional and conservative queen, stood in a strange and poignant relation to it. By the time she married the king, the break with Rome was complete. Henry had made himself supreme head of the Church in England, repudiated the authority of the Pope, and set the kingdom on a course away from the universal Catholic Church that had shaped English life for 1,000 years. And now, during the very months of Jane's reign, the next and most dramatic phase of the revolution was underway, the dissolution of the monasteries, the systematic closing down of England's religious houses, and the seizure of their wealth. This was an enormous undertaking, and a deeply traumatic one for much of the country. Across England stood hundreds of monasteries and convents and priories, some of them centuries old, ancient and seemingly eternal institutions that held vast wealth in land and treasure, that housed communities of monks and nuns, that provided charity and learning and hospitality and employment, that were woven into the fabric of local life in every part of the kingdom. And now, one by one, they were being closed, their communities turned out, their treasures seized for the crown, their lands sold off to the gentry and nobility whose support the king needed, their proud buildings stripped of anything valuable and left to fall into ruin. It was the largest transfer of wealth in English history, and it tore at the deep traditional structures of the country, destroying institutions that had stood for centuries and that many ordinary people loved and depended on. For Jane, this must have been a source of quiet distress, for she was of conservative and old sympathies attached to the old religion, the kind of person who would naturally have mourned the destruction of the monasteries and the old certainties they represented. She was a Catholic in her heart, in the traditional way of her class and her upbringing, and she was married to the man who was dismantling the old faith, presiding at the side of a revolution that her own instincts must have recoiled from. It was a delicate and painful position, and Jane handled it the only way she safely could, which was with discretion, keeping her own counsel, not openly opposing the king's policies, for she had seen what opposition cost. But her sympathies were known, and she became, for the many in England who grieved the passing of the old ways, a focus of hope, the one figure who might, it was hoped, gently incline the king back toward mercy and moderation. That hope found its fullest expression and its sharpest disappointment in the one moment when Jane dared to speak, the moment of the pilgrimage of grace, when she knelt to beg the king for mercy toward the rebels and the restoration of the abbeys, and was sharply and publicly rebuked for her pains. That episode, which we will come to in its fullness, revealed the limits of Jane's influence over the weighty matters of religion and state, which were in truth very small. She was the gentle old faith consort, beloved by the conservative-minded as a symbol of the old ways, but she had no real power to halt or even soften the revolution the king was driving, and when she tried, she was slapped down and reminded of her place. The dissolution went on, the monasteries fell, the old world was dismantled, and she could do nothing but watch, presiding helplessly over the destruction of the faith she held dear, married to the man who was destroying it, her sympathies and unspoken grief that her position would not allow her to express. It is one of the small tragedies woven through her brief reign, the traditional woman caught up in the revolution that was unmaking her traditional world, but there was a hard limit to Jane's influence and to the king's affection, and she discovered exactly where that limit lay in the most public and humiliating way, in an episode that reveals, more clearly than anything else, the true nature of her position. In the autumn of 1536, a vast rebellion broke out in the north of England, the largest and most dangerous uprising of Henry's entire reign, a rising we call the Pilgrimage of Grace. Tens of thousands of ordinary people, led by gentry and commons together, rose in protest against the religious revolution, against the dissolution of the monasteries, against the break with the old faith and the destruction of the old ways. It was a vast and serious challenge to the king's authority, and it frightened the government badly. And it was into this charged and frightening moment that Jane, moved by the suffering and by her own traditional sympathies, made the one political intervention of her reign, an act that revealed her gentle heart and her political innocence in the same gesture, and that came perilously close to undoing her. We will come to exactly what she did and what it cost her. But first, the rising itself deserves a closer look. The king's response was swift and cold and brutal, and it must have struck Jane like a slap. He rebuked her sharply, publicly, telling her to get up and to attend to other things, to mind her own business, and then he said the words that no one present could have failed to understand, the words that carried the whole weight of the recent past. He reminded her, in effect, that she should remember what had happened to the last queen who had meddled in matters that did not concern her. He invoked Anne. He told his gentle, kneeling wife to think of her predecessor, the queen who had overreached and been destroyed, as a warning of what awaited a wife who forgot her place. It was a moment of chilling clarity, and it taught Jane, if she did not already know it, exactly where she stood. The affection was real but conditional. The favour could be withdrawn. The scaffold was always there, in the background, the ultimate argument that ended all discussion. She had knelt to beg for mercy, moved by genuine compassion, and the king had answered by reminding her that she too could be discarded, that her position rested entirely on her remaining as he wished. She rose, and she was silent, and she never again, as far as we know, attempted to influence her husband on a weighty matter of state. She had learned the limit. She would not test it again. That single episode tells you more about Jane's marriage than any amount of speculation about love. She was the beloved wife, the longed-for comfort, the gentle queen, and she was also, always, one misstep away from her predecessor's fate, and she knew it. And Henry made sure she knew it. The relationship was warm on the surface and unequal to its foundations. An aging, dangerous king and a young, careful wife who understood that her safety depended on perfect compliance. After the rebuke, Jane retreated into the safe quietness that was her nature and her strategy both, the obedient and undemanding queen, asking nothing, challenging nothing, making no trouble, and she turned her hopes, as Henry turned his, to the one thing that would set her beyond all danger of a fall, the one thing that would make her not just the king's comfort, but the mother of his heir, untouchable, triumphant, safe forever. She turned her hopes to the child she now, at last, was carrying. For by the early months of 1537, Jane Seymour was pregnant. It had begun in Lincolnshire and spread with alarming speed across the northern counties, gathering in farmers and labourers and parish priests alongside the gentry who led them, until it had swelled into something that looked less like a riot than an army. What gave it its peculiar power was its character as a holy cause. The rebels framed their rising as a pilgrimage in defence of the old faith, and they marched beneath banners painted with the 5 wounds of Christ, carrying crosses and singing, a host of the aggrieved and the devout who believed they were defending God's church against a king who had broken it. To the frightened government in the south, this was the most terrifying kind of enemy, not a faction to be bought off, but a multitude convinced of its own righteousness, demanding that Henry turn back from the whole course of his revolution. Their grievances were many, but at the heart of them lay the religious changes, above all the dissolution of the monasteries, which struck directly at the communities and the faith and the way of life of the conservative North. They demanded the restoration of the abbeys, the protection of the old church, the removal of the king's low-born ministers like Thomas Cromwell, whom they blamed for the revolution, and a return to the old ways and the old certainties. It was a serious and frightening challenge, the largest force assembled in England in living memory, and for a time it genuinely threatened the king's authority in the north, far larger than any force the crown could immediately field against it. Henry's government was alarmed, and rightly so, for had the rising been better led and more united, it might have done real damage. The king's response was, characteristically, a mixture of guile and ruthlessness. He could not crush the rising by force at first, so he temporized, offering promises and pardons, persuading the rebels to disperse with assurances that their grievances would be heard and addressed, that a parliament would be called, that their demands would be considered. The rebels, trusting these royal promises, went home, and then, when a fresh disturbance gave him the pretext, Henry broke his word and took his revenge, unleashing a brutal repression across the north, the leaders rounded up and executed, hundreds put to death, the rebellion drowned in blood as a lesson to any who might think of rising again. It was a display of treachery and cruelty that revealed exactly the kind of man Henry had become, a man who would promise mercy to disperse his enemies and then slaughter them once they were disarmed, and it cast a long shadow of fear across the kingdom. And so we return to Jane's intervention, the one moment she stepped from the safe shadows into the glare of politics. With the rebellion raging and Henry's authority under threat, she knelt before him in front of the court and begged him to show mercy to the rebels, to restore the abbeys, to listen to the grievances of his people. It was an act of genuine compassion and, in the circumstances, of considerable courage, for to plead the cause of rebels to a king who saw them as traitors was no small thing. But it was also, in the brutal calculus of that court, a dangerous misstep, an intrusion into matters of state that a wife was supposed to leave alone, and the king's response taught Jane, in the most public and humiliating way, exactly where the limits of her position lay. He rebuked her sharply, told her to rise and attend to other things, and reminded her, in words no one could mistake, of what had happened to the last queen who meddled. She learned her lesson. She never spoke on such matters again. Before we follow Jane into the ordeal and triumph of her pregnancy, let us pause to picture the world she now inhabited, the texture of her brief reign, because she held the position for only about 17 months, and we should see her in it while we can. As queen, she presided over a large household of her own, hundreds of servants and officers and ladies, with her own apartments in each of the royal palaces, hung with rich tapestries and furnished with every luxury the age could provide. Her rooms were warm with fires and bright with the best wax candles, scented with the herbs strewn underfoot, and she dressed now in the magnificent clothing of her rank, the velvets and damasks and cloth of gold, the jewels, some of which had belonged to her predecessors, passed down from Catherine to Anne to her in a grim succession that none of the women involved could have found comfortable. She had ladies of her own to attend her, some of them the very women who had served Anne and Catherine, the same faces serving a new mistress, the court reforming itself around each new mistress, with a continuity that must have felt strange and even sinister to those who lived through all the changes. The tone Jane set in her household was, as we have seen, one of dignified decorum, a deliberate contrast to the brilliant, flirtatious, French-influenced court that Anne had kept. Jane required her ladies to dress modestly and behave demurely, to conduct themselves with a propriety that reflected her own quiet temperament and her chosen image as the virtuous and obedient queen. The endless round of court life went on, the religious observances, the attendance on the queen, the meals taken with ceremony, the evenings of music and entertainment, but all of it in a more restrained and decorous key than before, the calm after the storm. Jane occupied herself with the things that suited her, her needlework above all, at which she excelled and which she encouraged among her ladies, the patient domestic art that was so perfectly expressive of her nature. She was, in these months, the picture of a settled and contented queen, presiding gently over a settled court, secure in the king's affection, asking nothing more than to fulfill the role she had been given. It is worth asking how she was seen by the people of her own time, the court and the country around her, because the contemporary view of her differs in interesting ways from the dismissive legend that later grew up. To the court that watched her rise, she was, at first, something of a puzzle and perhaps a disappointment. The ambassadors and courtiers who recorded their impressions noted her plainness, her quietness, her lack of the dazzling qualities that had marked her predecessor. One foreign ambassador, sizing up the new queen with a diplomat's cool eye, remarked that she was of no special beauty, that she was pale and plain, that she was past her first youth, and wondered, with the cynicism of his trade, what the king could see in her after the brilliant Anne. To eyes accustomed to the sparkle of Anne Boleyn, the modest Seymour girl seemed a strange and unspectacular choice, and there was a certain bafflement in those early reports at the king's preference for so plain and unremarkable a woman. But as the months passed, the view of Jane softened and warmed, and the qualities that had seemed at first like mere dullness came to be appreciated as virtues. Observers noted her gentleness, her kindness, her good sense, the calm and decorous tone she set at court, the contrast she offered to the turbulence of Anne's reign. She came to be respected, even liked, a queen who made no enemies, who caused no scandal, who went about her role with a quiet dignity that won people over by degrees. And when she bore the king his son, all doubts were swept away in the universal rejoicing, and she became, for that brief shining moment, the most celebrated woman in England, the mother of the heir, the queen who had succeeded where her predecessors had failed, beloved and honoured throughout the realm. The common people, too, seemed to have taken to Jane, or at least to have welcomed what she represented. After the turbulence and division of the years of Anne Boleyn, after the upheaval of the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, there was a hunger in the country for calm, for healing, for a return to older and steadier ways, and Jane, the gentle traditional queen of conservative sympathies, seemed to embody that hope. To the many who had been distressed by the religious revolution, she was a reassuring figure, a wife who might draw the king back toward the old faith and the old mercies. And when she bore the heir that the kingdom had prayed for, she became the focus of a wave of popular joy and gratitude, the queen who had secured the succession and given England its prince, celebrated with bonfires and bells and rejoicing in town and village. It was only later, in the longer perspective of history, that she came to be diminished, reduced to the colourless figure between two fascinating women, the dull interval in a dramatic story. Her own contemporaries, who saw her whole and in her moment, knew her as a real and respected consort, modest and gentle and kind, who set a tone of calm after years of storm, and who gave him the thing he most desired. The dismissive legend came afterward, the work of a posterity that found Catherine's tragic defiance and Anne's brilliant fall more compelling than Jane's quiet competence, and that reduced her, unfairly, to the wife who did nothing but bear a son and die. But in her own time she was seen more justly as a woman who had risen to an extraordinary position and filled it with an unassuming grace, and who had done, in giving the king his heir, the one supreme thing that the whole age agreed a queen was for. We would do well to recover something of that contemporary view, to see Jane as the people who saw her in life beheld her, not as a footnote, but as a woman who in her brief moment was genuinely valued and genuinely mourned. We understand frustratingly little about the inner life of Jane during these months, what she thought and felt as she occupied the most dangerous throne in Europe, because she remains, even at the height of her fortune, maddeningly opaque to us. She left no letters of any substance, no record of her thoughts, no window into her heart. We see her only from the outside, through the eyes of others, the ambassadors and courtiers who noted her appearance and her behaviour, but could not, or did not, see into her mind. We do not know whether she was happy or frightened, whether she loved the king or merely served him out of duty and self-preservation. We cannot tell whether she thought of Anne, whose place she had taken, whose jewels she now wore, whose ladies now served her, who had died 11 days before her own wedding. We have no way to tell whether the rebuke over the pilgrimage of grace haunted her, the reminder of how easily she too could fall. We cannot know. She kept her own counsel, as she had always done, the reserved woman who gave nothing away, and her silence has followed her into history, leaving us to guess at the person behind the gentle, obedient, opaque surface. What we can say is that her position, secure as it seemed, was in truth only as secure as her ability to deliver the one thing the crown required, and that everything depended on her bearing a son. This was the foundation of her marriage and the condition of her safety. The king had married her, above all, in the hope that she would give him the male heir that Catherine and Anne had both failed to provide, the prince who would secure the Tudor dynasty and spare England the nightmare of a disputed succession. Jane's whole value, in the cold dynastic arithmetic of the age, lay in her womb. If she bore a son, she would be triumphant, untouchable, mother of the king to come, beloved and secure beyond any possibility of a fall. If she failed, if she proved barren or bore only daughters or lost her children as her predecessors had, then she would be just another disappointing wife, and she had seen twice over exactly what became of disappointing wives at this court. The stakes could not have been higher. Her life, quite literally, might depend on the sex of a child not yet born. And so when, in the early months of 1537, it became clear that she was pregnant, the hope and the fear that gathered around her swelling body were almost beyond imagining. We should pause to understand why a son mattered so desperately, why the whole tragedy of Henry's reign and the whole meaning of Jane's life turned on the bearing of a male child, because to a modern mind the obsession can seem strange, even monstrous, and it needs explaining. The answer lies in the recent and bloody history of England, in the living memory of the horrors that a disputed succession could bring. Not long before, within the lifetimes of men still living, England had been torn apart by the savage civil wars that we call the Wars of the Roses, Decades of slaughter in which rival branches of the royal family had fought for the crown, in which kings had been made and unmade and murdered, in which the noble families of the kingdom had destroyed one another in battle after battle. The Tudor dynasty itself had been born out of that chaos. Henry's father seizing the crown on the battlefield and ending the wars, and the whole Tudor project ever after was about ensuring that such chaos never returned. And the key to preventing it, everyone believed, was a clear and unquestioned succession, a strong male heir to follow the king without dispute. A son could inherit the throne and command the loyalty of the leading men of the realm in a way that, it was feared, a daughter could not. England had never been successfully ruled by a queen in her own right, and the prospect of a female succession was regarded with deep anxiety as an invitation to instability, to challenge, to the renewal of the dynastic wars that had so nearly destroyed the kingdom. A monarch without a son was one whose death might plunge the realm back into chaos, and so the getting of a male heir was not merely a personal desire, but, in the king's mind, and the minds of his subjects, a matter of national survival, the one thing that could secure the peace and prevent the return of the horrors that the older generation remembered. This is the context in which we have to understand Henry's increasingly desperate pursuit of a son, the context that turned his failure to get one with Catherine into what he genuinely came to believe was a crisis touching the very safety of the realm. It is the context that made the bearing of a male heir the supreme duty of a queen, the one thing above all others that she existed to provide, and that turned the failure to provide it into a catastrophe that could destroy her. Catherine failed and was cast off. Anne failed and was destroyed. And the whole weight of this desperate dynastic need came to rest in 1537 on the body of the unremarkable woman from Wolf Hall, who carried in her pregnancy not merely her own hopes and the king's, but, as everyone believed, the future stability and peace of the entire kingdom. The stakes could not have been higher, and they explain the intensity of the joy when Jane succeeded, the bonfires and the bells and the wild rejoicing, for she had given England not merely a prince, but, it seemed, security itself, deliverance from the dread of a disputed succession, and a return to the wars. To that. The news of the Queen's pregnancy, confirmed in the spring of 1537, sent a wave of joy and desperate hope through the king and the court and the whole kingdom. Here at last was the prospect of the longed-for child, the prince who would justify everything, secure the dynasty, set the seal on the king's long struggle and all the upheaval it had caused. Henry was overjoyed, attentive, protective, fussing over his pregnant queen with all the tender care that his hopes inspired. She was cosseted and indulged, her every whim attended to, the precious vessel of the dynasty's future treated with the utmost care, and Jane, at the middle of it all, carried the future of England in her body through the long months, toward the autumn, toward the ordeal of childbirth, toward the triumph and the catastrophe that waited together at the end. There is a detail from these months that has become one of the most human and endearing things in Jane's whole story, and it is worth lingering on, because it gives us a rare glimpse of warmth between the difficult monarch and his gentle queen. Jane, in her pregnancy, developed a craving for quail, those small game birds, and the king, delighted to indulge her, went to considerable trouble to satisfy the longing. Quail were sent for, fetched from across the Channel, from Calais and Flanders, to be served fat and fresh to the pregnant queen, the doting husband moving heaven and earth to give his wife the delicacy she craved. It is a small thing, but it is touching. The image of the aging, dangerous king fussing over his pregnant wife's appetite for quail, sending across the sea to satisfy her, and it suggests a genuine tenderness in the relationship, at least in these hopeful months. A real care and affection focused on the precious queen who carried the dynasty's future in her body. The whole kingdom shared in the hope and the anxiety. Prayers were said in churches across England for the Queen's safe delivery and, above all, for the birth of a prince. The longing for a male heir was not merely the king's private obsession, but a national concern, for everyone understood that the stability of the realm depended on the succession, that a clear male heir would secure the peace, and a failure might mean disputed succession and the horror of civil war that the country remembered all too well. So the prayers rose from parish after parish, and the court watched the Queen's changing body with an intensity of longing that is hard for us now to imagine, the whole future of the kingdom seeming to hang on the single child she carried. And for Jane herself, the pregnancy must have been the fulfillment of everything. What would secure her place past all danger of a fall, that would transform her from merely the king's gentle comfort into the mother of the future king, untouchable and triumphant. She had seen what happened to queens who failed to bear a son, had watched Catherine and Anne both destroyed in large part by that failure, and she knew that her own safety, perhaps her very life, depended on giving the king the prince he craved. Now, carrying his child, she carried also her own salvation, the guarantee of her place and her future, and she must have prayed through those long months with an intensity to match the kingdom's for the safe delivery of a living son. The hope was almost unbearable, for her and for the king and for the realm, the longed-for heir growing toward birth through the spring and summer of 1537. The whole weight of a dynasty's future gathering around the body of the modest woman from Wolf Hall as she moved through her pregnancy toward the autumn, toward the ordeal, toward the triumph and the catastrophe that waited together at the end. To understand what Jane faced as her time approached, we have to understand what childbirth meant in the 16th century, because it was an ordeal that we, in our age of safe and managed delivery, can scarcely imagine, and for a queen the stakes and the dangers were greater still. Childbirth in the Tudor age was the central peril of every woman's life, the most dangerous thing she would ever do, and it killed women in numbers that would horrify us now. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of infection, no real medical help of the kind we would recognize, only midwives working by tradition and experience, and the ever-present risk of a birth that went wrong, of bleeding that could not be stopped, of fevers that came after and could not be cured. A terrible number of women died in childbed or in the days following, and every woman who approached her time knew it and prepared herself for the possibility of death as well as the hope of new life. For a woman to enter her confinement was to enter into real and present danger, and the prayers said for her were not mere form, but genuine pleas for a safe passage through a genuine peril. For a queen, the process was hedged about with elaborate and ancient custom that governed every stage of a royal birth. As her time approached, she would withdraw from the world into her confinement, a period of seclusion in specially prepared chambers, away from the eyes of the court and the bustle of public life. The room was made ready according to old tradition, the windows covered, the air kept warm and still and dim, the mother-to-be sealed away in a kind of enclosed and shadowed sanctuary to await her delivery. It was a realm of women, for once she entered her confinement, the men withdrew, even the king, and she was attended only by her ladies and her midwives and those who would see her through the ordeal. The chamber was hung with rich tapestries, though any depicting frightening or distressing scenes were removed, lest they trouble her, or, as the superstition of the age held, harm the child. Everything was arranged to keep her calm, comfortable, and enclosed, in the warm, dim privacy, where she would either bring forth new life, or perhaps meet her death. She entered her confinement at the palace of Hampton Court in the autumn of 1537, withdrawing into the prepared chambers to await the birth that the whole kingdom was praying for. And there, in the warm and shadowed seclusion of the Queen's apartments, attended by her women, she came at last to her time and faced the ordeal toward which her whole extraordinary journey had been leading. Processions wound through the streets, and prayers rose in the churches for her safe delivery. The whole anxious hope of a kingdom gathered around one labouring woman in a darkened room, and then the long ordeal began. And we can only imagine what those 2 days and nights were like for Jane, the exhaustion and the pain and the fear, the endless hours of labour with no relief and no certainty of survival, the knowledge that women died doing this, and that she might die too, even as she carried the hope of a kingdom. She had no way to ease the pain, no way to hasten the birth, nothing to do but endure it, hour after hour, through the dragging hours and the longer nights, attended by her women, sustained by prayer, fighting the oldest and most dangerous battle a woman could fight. And she endured it. She came through the ordeal, exhausted and depleted but alive, and at last, in the early hours of the 12th of October, 1537, she was delivered of her child. The long battle was won. The Queen had survived the birth, and the child was living, and the child, the longed-for, prayed-for, kingdom-saving child, was a boy. That moment, when the child was born and proved to be a living son, was the summit of Jane's life and the vindication of everything, the triumph toward which her whole improbable rise had been building. After the dangerous labour, after the years of the kingdom's hope, here at last was the prince, alive and healthy, the male heir that 2 queens before she had failed to provide, the son who secured the dynasty and crowned Jane's astonishing fortune. She had done it. The ordinary girl from Wolf Hall had succeeded where the proud Princess of Spain and the brilliant Anne Boleyn had both failed, had given the king his son, had reached the very pinnacle of what a queen could achieve, and for a few days, a very few precious ones, she had it all, the glory and the joy and the secure and untouchable place of her who had borne the heir. She did not yet know, as she lay recovering from her long ordeal and receiving the joyful congratulations of the court, that the same birth that had crowned her with triumph had also, in the way of that merciless age, planted in her the sickness that would kill her within the fortnight. For the moment there was only triumph. The dying would come later, and soon, and the child was a boy, a son, a living, healthy, lusty prince. After all the years, all the failed marriages, all the dead and stillborn infants, all the upheaval and tragedy and bloodshed, after Catherine's long procession of tiny coffins and Anne's desperate failures and the breaking of a kingdom away from Rome, here at last was what it had all been for, a son for the King of England, a male heir to secure the dynasty. Jane Seymour, the plain, ordinary girl from Wolf Hall, had done what the proud Princess of Spain and the brilliant Anne Boleyn had both failed to do. She had given Henry the son he craved. The relief and the joy were beyond anything words could capture. The news flew out from Hampton Court across the kingdom, and the response was an explosion of celebration such as England had rarely seen. Church bells rang out across the land. Bonfires were lit in the streets. Cannon were fired from the Tower of London. There was singing and feasting and wild rejoicing in every town and village, the whole pent-up hope of decades released in a single night of triumph. The king had his son. The prince was named Edward, and he would one day be king. And then came the christening 3 days later, and here we arrive at last at the scene with which we began this evening, the blazing triumph by torchlight, the summit of Jane's whole life. The little boy was christened on the night of the 15th of October, in the chapel at Hampton Court, in a ceremony of overwhelming magnificence, the celebration of the dynasty's secured future. It was held at night, and the chapel and the processional route blazed with the light of hundreds of torches, the flames glittering on cloth of gold and jewels, and the rich robes of the assembled nobility of England. The infant prince was carried in solemn procession to the font beneath a canopy, attended by the foremost lords and ladies of the realm, his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth given honoured places. The whole court gathered in its full splendour to welcome the heir. It was a blaze of triumph and relief and joy, the visible proof that the dynasty was secure, that the king had his son, that all the long ordeal was vindicated at last, and Jane, the mother of it all, the woman who had given England its prince, lay in her chamber nearby, propped up to receive the congratulations of the court, the most fortunate and successful of all Henry's queens. She had everything. She had done the one duty that mattered. She was the mother of the heir, beloved and secure and victorious, and she was already, though no one yet knew it, beginning to die. I want to tell the end gently, because it was not gentle, and because Jane deserves to have her death told with the dignity that her quiet life so often lacked in the telling. The triumph lasted only days. She had survived the long and brutal labour, and brought forth her living son, and for a little while all seemed well. The Queen recovering, the Prince thriving, the kingdom rejoicing, but within a few days of the birth itself, Jane began to sicken. What struck her was almost certainly the thing that struck down so many women in the hours and days after childbirth, an infection of the kind that the medicine of the age could neither prevent nor cure, what was then called childbed fever, a contamination of the body in the aftermath of birth, that, without the antibiotics we now possess, was very often fatal. It may have been worsened by the long and difficult labour, perhaps by part of the afterbirth left behind, perhaps simply by the unhygienic conditions that no one of that age understood to guard against. Whatever the precise cause, within a week of her triumph the Queen was gravely ill, feverish and failing, her body, having done the one thing it was required to do, now giving way. The decline was swift. She rallied a little, then worsened, the fever taking hold, her strength ebbing through the dark span following the christening. The king, who had been so overjoyed at the birth of his son, was now confronted with the prospect of losing the wife who had given him that son. And by the accounts that survive, he was genuinely distressed, hovering, anxious, reluctant to leave. The physicians did what little they could, which was almost nothing, for they had no understanding of infection and no means to fight it. The prayers that had been offered for her safe delivery now became prayers for her recovery, and then, as it became clear which way things were going, prayers for her soul. Jane received the last rites of the church she had been raised in, and had never abandoned, the traditional faith that had sustained her quietly all her life. And in the night of the 24th of October 1537, less than 2 weeks after the birth of her son, just 12 days after her triumph, Jane Seymour died. She was perhaps 28 or 29 years old. She had been queen for some 17 months. She had borne the king his heir and been destroyed by the giving of it. Dead within days of the summit of her fortune, the child she had borne left motherless in his cradle. There is a terrible irony in it, and a terrible poignancy, and it has fixed Jane forever in the popular memory in that single bleak phrase, the wife who gave the king his son and was gone. She prevailed where the others failed, and her success killed her. She reached the very pinnacle, did the one thing that mattered, secured her place beyond any possibility of a fall, and then, at the moment of her triumph, was carried off by the oldest and commonest danger of a woman's life. Had she lived, who knows what she might have become, how the king's affection might have grown or cooled. whether she might have given him more children or fallen from favour as the others had, whether she might have aged into a settled and comfortable queenship, or met some other fate in the dangerous years to come. We will never know, because she did not live, and the not living is the central fact of her story, the thing that shaped her whole legend. She died at the perfect moment, if we can bear to put it so coldly, died beloved and triumphant and undefeated, before time could test her or the king could tire of her, and that early death preserved her, in a way, as the one wife Henry never came to resent, the one who left him while he still loved her. For the king mourned her, and his mourning was real, and it was lasting, and it tells us something true about what she had meant to him. Henry, who had cast off Catherine and beheaded Anne, who would go on to discard and behead more wives still, mourned Jane Seymour with a grief that all the accounts agree was genuine, and the manner of that mourning and of the funeral he gave her is worth seeing in full. The king's grief when she died was real and visible and lasting, and the funeral he gave her was a magnificent thing, and both deserve to be seen, because they tell us how much this unassuming woman had come to mean to him. Henry was, by the accounts that survive, genuinely stricken by Jane's death in a way that he had not been and would not be by the loss or removal of his other wives. He had cast off Catherine without a backward glance, and sent Anne to the scaffold without mercy, but Jane's death seems to have wounded him truly. He withdrew from the world in his grief, retreating to his private chambers, unwilling to attend to business, sunk in a sorrow that those around him noted as genuine and deep. He put on black, the colour of deepest mourning, and wore it for an extended period, far longer than custom strictly required, a public sign of a private grief. For a man not much given to mourning the women in his life, it was a remarkable display of real feeling, and it has done much to fix Jane in memory as the wife Henry truly loved. The funeral was grand and solemn, befitting the queen who had given the king his heir. Jane's body lay in state, and the elaborate rituals of royal mourning were observed in full, the vigils and the masses, and the slow ceremony of a great state funeral. And then she was carried to Windsor, to St. George's Chapel within the castle walls, and there she was buried with all the honour due to the mother of the prince. Her stepdaughter Mary, the unhappy young woman to whom she had been so kind, acted as chief mourner, following the body and grieving sincerely for the stepmother she had lost, the one who had reached out to her in her darkness and helped to bring her home. It was a funeral fit for a beloved queen, and it expressed in its grandeur and its solemnity both the king's genuine grief and the special status that she had earned by giving him the thing no other wife had managed, a living son. And the king's devotion to Jane's memory did not fade with the funeral. Through all the years that followed, through 3 more marriages, Henry continued to regard Jane as something special, the wife above all the others, the one he had loved and lost. He kept her memory honoured. He provided for her family, advancing her brothers and maintaining the Seymour connection. And when his own death approached 10 years later, he gave the final and clearest proof of what she had meant to him, directing that he should be buried not beside any of his other wives, but beside Jane Seymour, in the same vault at Windsor where she lay. And so it was done. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he was laid to rest beside Jane, the 2 of them together in the same tomb. The king and the wife he called his true wife, the only one of the 6 he chose to lie with for eternity. They are there still, beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel, the king and Jane Seymour together through all the centuries since. There is something both moving and revealing in that final choice, the king selecting from among all his wives the modest 3rd one to share his tomb. It was a genuine tribute, an expression of true and lasting feeling for the gentle woman who had given him his heir and then died. But it is worth remembering, as we honour the genuineness of his grief, that she had earned this special place partly by dying when she did, at the summit of her fortune, before the relationship could sour as the others had soured. Henry mourned her truly, and chose to lie beside her, and called her his true wife, and all of that was real. But she was also the wife he never had time to tire of, the perfect memory preserved by an early death, idealized in part precisely because she was gone before she could disappoint him. His devotion to her was real, and it was also, in part, devotion to an ideal, to the gentle, obedient, fruitful wife, frozen forever at the moment of her triumph. Both things are true, and both belong to the strange story of Jane Seymour, the wife Henry loved most, partly because she was the wife he lost soonest. So we come to the question of whether Henry loved her, the question that hangs over Jane's whole story, and it deserves a careful and honest answer, because the truth is more interesting than either the romantic legend of the beloved true wife or the cynical dismissal of the convenient brood mare. The honest answer is that we cannot fully know, because she left us no window into the relationship, and Henry's feelings are always hard to read beneath the performance of kingship, but that the evidence points towards something real and yet sharply limited, a genuine affection bounded by the hard conditions of the king's nature and Jane's position. Henry was fond of Jane, that much seems clear, fond of her gentleness and her calm and the peace she brought him after the storms of his earlier marriages. He treated her with care and indulgence, fussed over her in her pregnancy, grieved sincerely at her death, and honoured her memory above his other wives. There was feeling there, real feeling. And yet, for all Henry's evident contentment, we should not let the talk of his devotion soften the hard truth of Jane's situation, which the rebuke over the pilgrimage of grace had laid bare. His affection, real as it was, rested entirely on her remaining what he wanted her to be, soft and obedient and untroubling. The moment she stepped out of that allotted role, even in an act of pure compassion, he turned cold and reminded her, with a chilling reference to her executed predecessor, of exactly how precarious her place remained. Beneath the fondness and the gratitude lay the same ruthlessness that had destroyed the women before her, held in check only so long as she gave no cause to rouse it. She lived, as both her predecessors had lived, on the king's pleasure, and she of all people understood how swiftly that pleasure could curdle. Her safety was not in his love, it was in her own unbroken discretion, and in the son she carried. The deepest truth about the relationship is perhaps this, that she was loved most fully not in life but in memory, idealized after her death into the perfect wife in a way that the living woman, had she survived, could probably never have sustained. The other wives Henry came to know too well, and knowing them, came to resent or hate them, for the slow attrition of a marriage exposes every flaw and breeds every grievance. Jane he never had time to know in that wearing way. She gave him his son, and then within days was gone, vanishing at the very peak of his regard, leaving behind only the perfect memory, untarnished, of the gentle, obedient, fruitful queen. And so Henry could love her, once she was gone, as he had perhaps not quite loved her in life, could idealize her without the inconvenient reality of an actual ongoing marriage to complicate the picture, could make her, in memory, the true wife she might never have remained had she lived. Her death made her perfect, and Henry loved the perfect memory. This is not to say his feeling was false, for grief and idealization can be perfectly genuine, and Henry's clearly were. It is only to say that the relationship was shaped, in the end, as much by Jane's early death as by anything that passed between them in life, and that the legend of the beloved true wife rests heavily on the fact that she died before that love could be tested by time. Had she lived, had she aged and quarrelled, and perhaps failed to bear more sons, had the king's eye wandered as it always wandered, she might well have ended like the others, set aside or worse, just another of Henry's discarded queens. We cannot know. What we know is that she did not live to be tested, that she died beloved and triumphant at the summit of her fortune, and that Henry mourned her and idealized her and chose to lie beside her forever. Whether that is love, or the memory of love, or gratitude wearing love's face, each of us must judge. But it was something real, and it was something limited. And it was, in the end, the strange and unequal bond between a dangerous aging husband and the quiet woman who gave him his heir and then was gone. And what became of all she left behind, the son and the family and the legacy of her brief, bright, fatal queenship. The son, the little Prince Edward, whose birth had cost his mother her life, grew up motherless, raised with anxious care as the precious heir to the throne, a clever and serious and sickly boy. When Henry passed in 1547, the boy became King Edward VI, at just 9 years old, the first Protestant king of England, in whose name the religious revolution his father had begun was driven further and faster than ever toward the full establishment of the Reformed faith. But Edward was never strong, and he did not live to grow up. He died in 1553, still only 15, his short reign ending almost before it had properly begun, and with him died the direct male line of the Tudors, the very thing his mother had given her life to secure. The son she gave her life to bring into the world reigned for 6 years and died a boy, and the crown passed, in the end, to the daughters whom everyone had once thought not good enough, first to Mary, Catherine's daughter, and then to Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, the 2 discarded princesses who would each in turn rule England as queen. The longed-for prince proved a brief candle. It was the daughters who endured. Let us follow for a moment the child whose birth had cost her everything, the little Prince Edward, because his story is the strange and poignant sequel to hers, and because it casts a melancholy light back on the sacrifice she made. Edward was the most precious child in England. From the moment of his birth, the longed-for male heir, the prince whose arrival had been celebrated with such wild rejoicing, the son who secured the dynasty and justified everything his father had done. And because he was so precious, he was raised with extraordinary care, almost suffocating care, guarded and cosseted and protected from every danger, his household run with obsessive attention to his health and safety, for he was the single thread on which the whole Tudor future hung. He grew into a clever, serious, solemn, bookish boy, well educated in the new learning, raised by tutors of reforming sympathies into a convinced young Protestant, the very opposite, in his religion, of his traditional Catholic mother, who had not lived to shape him. He was never strong. For all the care lavished on him, Edward was a sickly child, and his frailty was a constant anxiety to those around him, for everything depended on his survival. When his father Henry at last died, in 1547, Edward became king at just 9 years old, King Edward VI, and because he was a child, the real power fell to others, above all to his uncle, Jane's brother Edward Seymour, who made himself Lord Protector and ruled in the boy king's name. Under Edward, or rather under those who governed for him, the religious revolution that his father had begun was driven far further toward the full establishment of the Protestant faith, the Mass abolished, the churches stripped, the English prayer book introduced, the Reformation that Henry had started for his own dynastic reasons, now pursued in earnest for reasons of genuine conviction. Edward himself, young as he was a fervent believer in the new faith, and had he lived he might have made England Protestant by his own settled will. But he did not live. The frail boy grew frailer, and in 1553, still only 15 years old, Edward VI was gone, his short reign ending almost before he had come to manhood, and with him the direct male line of the Tudors. Think of the bitter irony of it. Jane had given her life to bring this child into the world, the one wife who succeeded where the others failed, who bore the son that the breaking of a kingdom and the unmaking of 2 queens had all been for. And that long-awaited boy reigned a mere 6 years and guttered out at 15, leaving no child of his own, so that the whole vast effort, the annulments and the executions and the schism, and her own end in childbed, produced nothing more lasting than a brief candle of a reign. The son was not enough. The dynasty so dearly bought passed, within a few years, not to any child of his, but to the daughters everyone had once dismissed. And there is one more turn to it, gentler than the dynastic ironies, but in its way more touching. Of the kindnesses Jane managed in her short reign, the greatest was to Mary, the wronged stepdaughter. She coaxed back into her father's love. That same Mary would one day wear the crown, and after her the infant Elizabeth, at whose christening Mary had stood as godmother. The woman who had reached out in simple decency to a frightened and discarded young woman could not have known that she was being kind to a future Queen of England. It is a small grace note at the end of a life not overburdened with grace notes, that the one clear act of mercy the records preserve was offered, as it turned out, to one who would inherit the throne her own son so briefly held. To understand Jane fully, we have to see her in the context of the 6 wives together, for her meaning emerges most clearly in the comparison, in the place she holds in that famous and terrible sequence. There were 6 in all, the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and the old rhyme that English school children learn sums up their fates with brutal economy: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Jane is the died, the 3rd wife, the one in the middle, between the 2 who came to grief and the 3 who followed, and her place in the sequence is worth pondering, for she is the hinge on which the whole story turns, the wife who finally gave Henry what the first 2 could not, and whose death opened the way for the 3 who came after. Consider the contrasts. Catherine of Aragon, the first, was the proud and learned princess of Spain, who fought her husband to the end, and would not yield, and was destroyed by her own magnificent defiance, dying in cold exile, still insisting she was the true queen. Anne Boleyn, the second, was the brilliant and dangerous woman who had set the whole tragedy in motion, who blazed across the court and then fell to the scaffold, destroyed by the very man who had torn a kingdom apart to have her. And then came Jane, the third, the quiet opposite of both, who neither fought like the first queen nor blazed like Anne, but who obeyed and served and bore the heir and died of the giving. Where Catherine defied and Anne dazzled, Jane submitted, and where they were brought low she prevailed, and where they live in memory as tragic and dramatic figures, she is remembered, unfairly, as the dull one who merely did her duty. But there is a case to be made that Jane, precisely in her quietness, achieved what the more dramatic women did not. Her 2 predecessors were both, in the end, defeated, cast off and destroyed by the man they had married. Jane alone was never set aside, never came to grief at Henry's hands. She died beloved and honoured, the mother of his only legitimate son, the one wife he never turned against. In the brutal calculus of survival at that court, the unassuming Seymour did best of all the early wives, not by fighting or by dazzling, but by reading her dangerous age exactly and giving the king precisely what he wanted. Her quietness was not weakness but strategy, and it carried her to a height the bolder women never reached, the secure and untouchable standing of the one who had borne the heir, and to an end that, terrible as it was, came at the zenith of her fortune rather than in the bitterness of disgrace. And then came the three who followed, lifted into their dangerous eminence by the vacancy Jane's death created. Anne of Cleves, the fourth, the foreign bride, the king married and swiftly discarded, surviving by her wise willingness to be set aside. Catherine Howard, the fifth, the young girl who blazed briefly and fell to the scaffold like her cousin Anne Boleyn before her. And Catherine Parr, the sixth and last, the clever and careful woman who survived the aging king and outlived him. Each has her own story, and we will come to them in their turn on other evenings. But Jane stands at the middle of the six, the hinge, the one who succeeded where the first two failed and whose death opened the way for the last three, the gentle queen who gave the dynasty its heir and paid for it with her life. To see her among the six is to see her meaning, the still point in the middle of the most famous marital tragedy in English history, the ordinary woman whose extraordinary fate it was to be the one who in the end gave Henry his heir. So we come to the question of what we are to make of her, Jane Seymour, the third wife, the quiet one, the one who is remembered least. She is the hardest of the six to know, because she left us so little. No letters, no recorded words of any substance, no window into her heart, only the bare outline of her actions and the opaque surface of her gentle, obedient manner. She has been dismissed too often as a non-entity, a colourless nothing between two fascinating queens, the dull interval between Anne Boleyn and the dramas that followed. But the dismissal is unfair, and it misses what was genuinely remarkable about her. She was an ordinary woman who rose by a combination of fortune and family ambition and her own quiet shrewdness to the most extraordinary position in the kingdom, and who held it briefly with a skill and a self-command that the legend of the empty vessel entirely fails to credit. She understood her perilous age exactly, learned the lessons of her predecessors' falls, and played her own difficult hand with a control that kept her safe where bolder women had been destroyed. She used what little influence she dared to use for an act of genuine kindness, the reconciliation of a father and his wronged daughter. And she did the very thing that the whole machinery of the age demanded of a queen, provided the male heir, and paid for it with her life. And so we come to the end of it, and to the question of how we should finally weigh this reserved woman whose life we have followed tonight. We have stood at her tomb already, and seen how Henry chose, in the end, to lie beside her and no other, the clearest sign he ever gave of what she had meant to him. But a grave and a grand funeral are the world's verdict, the official summing up, and they do not quite answer the harder question, which is what we, looking back across 5 centuries, should make of the woman herself, beneath the legend and the marble. That is the question I want to sit with now, in these last few minutes together, before we let her rest. For the legend is cruel to her in its own quiet way. It remembers her as the dull one, the blank between two brilliant tragedies, the wife whose whole achievement was to bear a son and die. It allows her no inner life, no cleverness, no will of her own, as though she had simply drifted to the throne and drifted out of it again, a pale shape moved by other hands. That picture is not only unkind, it is wrong, and the whole of the evening we have spent together has been, in a sense, an argument against it, a patient gathering of the small pieces of evidence that show us someone far more interesting than the legend allows, a watchful and intelligent woman who knew exactly what she was doing in the most dangerous place in her world. And perhaps that is the truest place to leave her, not with the verdict of the histories, but with the simple human fact of a life. She was born in a quiet manor among the green hills of Wiltshire, an unremarkable girl in a large family, with no destiny that anyone could have predicted. She lived through the most dangerous years of the most dangerous court in Europe, watched two queens destroyed, and by some mixture of fortune, family design, and her own careful wisdom, rose to stand where they had stood. She held that perilous height for a year and a half, did one quiet act of mercy that the records remember, gave the king the son that everything had been for, and died in the giving of him at the very summit of her fortune, before the world could take any of it back. It is a short story and a strange one, and when we set aside the dismissive legend, it is the story not of a nonentity, but of a woman who played an impossible hand about as well as it could be played. She was not a saint, and not a schemer, and not a nothing, but a real and complicated woman, gentle by nature and shrewd by necessity, kind where she could afford to be and careful always, swept up by forces far larger than herself, and navigating them with more skill and more decency than she is usually credited with. She profited from a terrible injustice, the killing of the woman she replaced, and that shadow lies across her story, and cannot be wished away. But within the narrow room her dangerous position allowed her, she did more good than harm, and she met her astonishing fate, the rise and the triumph and the early death, with a quiet dignity that asks for our respect. She has lain at Windsor beside her king for nearly 500 years now, the gentle queen, the one remembered least, and tonight we have tried to remember her properly, not as a footnote, but as a person, an ordinary woman caught up in an extraordinary and merciless moment of history, who rose higher than anyone could have dreamed and died at the very summit, and who deserves at the last to be seen and known and remembered with kindness. And now the candles are burning low, and Jane's quiet story has been told all the way from the rambling manor in the green hills of Wiltshire to the torchlit chapel and the silent vault at Windsor, and there is nothing left to do but let it settle and let yourself drift down towards sleep. Let the scaffolds and the childbed and the blazing torches fade. Hold instead, if you want something gentle to carry down into the dark, the earliest picture, the ordinary girl at Wolf Hall, skilled with her needle, quiet among her many brothers and sisters, with the whole of her strange and brief and remarkable life still ahead of her and everything still possible. Let her be young again in the green West Country, among the sheep and the old forest, before any of the rest of it came. The past is gentle once it is finished. It cannot be changed, and it asks nothing of us except that we remember it kindly. And remembering kindly is a calm and a peaceful thing, the kind of thing that loosens the shoulders and slows the breath, and lets the whole long day finally go. If the hours we have spent together in her vanished world have brought you some measure of calm, then I am glad of it. And if you would like more of these quiet evenings to come and find you, you are always welcome to follow along. But that is a small thing, and it can wait for the morning. For now, wherever you are, and whatever the hour, I hope the house is warm around you, and the bed is soft beneath you, and the morning, when it comes, is gentle. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.